Chapter 1762. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:04 and 4 seconds AM. Chapter 1762, Demon. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. The soul construct quickly stood to her feet, her illusory crimson hair fluttering as she stood valiantly in the skies. She didn't seem to have a single hint of the grievances of the past, and her aura only seemed to grow. Kill! She roared. The world fell into silence as the woman turned around and charged toward her fellow family members. Her previously shrill shrieks were still echoing through the skies, but after a moment, they faded, replaced by passionate roars. She even seemed to smile, as though she couldn't be happier to battle for her pride of her emperor. Bang! 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 She directly killed 3 warriors of the Brazinger family. It was clear that in their final moments, they hesitated, not knowing whether or not to attack. And yet that small gap in time was enough in a battle of 7th-dimensional powerhouses. She laughed into the skies, her heroism booming beneath the flashing lightning. She became an arc of crimson herself as she flashed about. Everywhere she passed, another would fall, the strength she was exuding being enough to fill the hearts of true experts with respect and awe. However, for some reason, it just felt sad, down below. Coach Owen and Old Hutch had been watching from the very beginning, even with the raging torrent of battle around them. Their eyes had never once left Lionel. Their expressions weren't as happy as one might expect, even though the fate of the battle already seemed sealed. There was a hint of sadness in their eyes as well. Kind-hearted people didn't last very long in a world like this, and as such, there were only 2 paths for them to take. It was either they would lose their lives in the hands of others, or they would no longer be kind-hearted people. There didn't seem to be a third option. Neither of them wanted to see Lionel die. So that necessarily meant that they hoped a day like this one would come. But seeing it for themselves, it left a bitter taste. Most of it felt like it could be ignored, out of sight, out of mind, if you didn't think too much about what was happening. It was easy to make excuses for it or sweep it under the rug, but the appearance of this woman was too jarring, no matter what. That would a woman who had just lost her younger sister. A grieving sibling who wanted nothing more than revenge on Lionel. Sure, there might have been a past where she had contributed to the death of others, and likely even the direct death of Earthlings. But what about her sister? How many had Lionel killed in that single assault on the moon? How many were innocent? How many were vulnerable? How many were old men and women with only a few years left to enjoy? How many were children just starting out their lives? And maybe you could say that this was just a sin they would have to bear. After all, weren't the people of Earth victims as well? But which of them had stepped forward to condemn what had happened and what had been about to happen before Lionel appeared? Which of them had said a thing? Which of them had refused? But even so, this was something the Lionel they knew was completely incapable of doing, and yet, not only had he done it now, he had done it 4 times over without batting a single eye. The 2 had no idea. These 2 mentors of Lionel had no idea that he had already made a choice far worse than this one just months ago. He had already chosen Aina over the world. So what if he chose his brothers over a mere 4 families? At that moment, the woman's soul construct shattered for what felt like the 100th time. This time, however, she didn't seem capable of reforming. A large chunk of her torso had vanished and her entire right arm was nowhere to be seen. Even so, she laughed into the skies before punching out with her remaining arm and shoving it through the chest of an enemy. Another warrior took advantage and swung a mighty great sword down, severing her left arm. She lashed out with a leg, colliding against a head with her shin and cracking their skull into countless shards that pierced their brain through. Her legs were swept out from under her, quickly shattering beneath the pressure, and yet she still lunged forward, baring her teeth and ripping out the throat of the warrior who did it. Even in her final moments, she was endlessly valiant and she gave everything she had for her emperor, not feeling the sullenness of the atmosphere in the slightest. In fact, she felt nothing but elation and happiness, her laughter ironically grating on the ears of all those who heard. Bang! The woman's head shattered, her laughter finally fading, and yet somehow still echoing in all of their minds. The looks they gave toward the young man who had summoned her had changed from fury, to trepidation, to outright fear. And that was exactly when the young Lionel's lips separated once again. Rise. One after another, every brazinger the woman had killed began to rise up in a fog of violet, their souls appearing donned in armor that shone brighter than even the sun. Without hesitation, they all turned toward Lionel and slammed their fists against their chests, the reverberating impact booming even over the sound of the thunder. Then, they swiftly turned toward their own friends and family, releasing war cries that shook the skies as they charged. The hearts of the spectators went absolutely cold. They knew without a doubt that Lionel had done it on purpose. He could have beckoned them to revive even while the woman was fighting, but it was as though he wanted them all to personally witness her final moments, as though he wanted to force them to witness it all from start to finish. From her harrowing sorrow, to her valiant laugh and brave charge, he forced them to watch, all while he himself didn't seem to care in the slightest. Demon! Demon! Simeon stumbled backward, his will to fight having vanished into thin air. He tripped and fell, falling over the side of the platform that had once held him up. Announcement below. Chapter 1763. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:04 and 2 seconds AM. Chapter 1763. Update: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Will quickly lay out what's happening on my side so that you guys understand what's going on. Doing my best to try to get chapters out. But promises are hard. Right about now the east of Canada and where I'm currently at, Ottawa, is suffering from some freezing rain weather currently. The weather has caused trees to collapse on electricity lines, taking out the power in large sections of the city and even the Wi-Fi and cellular connectivity in some parts. The power was out at my place, so I went to a friend's who had power, but his Wi-Fi and cell service was out. I had to park outside a pizza shop with Wi-Fi to get this out. Big LS. All around, I'll do my best to get today's chapters out, including replacing this one with a real chapter, but if things don't go my way, that will potentially be impossible. Hey, race to hoping that things get fixed soon. It might not be possible for me to post any updates in the near future if they don't, so if you guys don't see anything just assume I couldn't make it work. Sorry about this, guys. I'll try to implement some sort of reward system again to make this up in the future if I can't. Chapter 1764. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:04 AM. Chapter 1764. Imperatrice: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Previous chapter has been replaced with a real chapter. Read it first. If you cannot see the update, go to Profile Settings, the clear cache. For those who don't understand why a chapter had to be replaced, the announcement is below. You are lucky. Lionel suddenly said as Simeon breathed his last few breaths. If not for your own foolishness, I would have made you suffer a fate far worse than this. Amidst his cackles and deliriousness, Simeon just barely managed to understand Lionel's words and they left him both stunned and infuriated. Was Lionel trying to say that he had showed mercy? This was the funniest thing he had ever heard in this short life of his, however. Before Simeon could think any further, the hand of Lionel's panda construct squeezed down, shattering what remained of Simeon to pieces, from start to finish. Simeon never managed to threaten Lionel even a single time. Rise. Lionel commanded. Simeon's soul was snatched in its attempt to dissipate, forming his body one again as his 8 lenses felt into his illusory hands. Simeon caught them and kneeled, bending his head from so far that his forehead nearly passed his knees. Lionel didn't even look at Simeon. Raising his head to look below, he stood in the skies. Carnage and blood flowing in rivers behind him. He wasn't the only one in the skies. His cousin Noah had approached and hadn't left from the very beginning. And yet it still felt that things were like this. Lionel was both close and yet so far. So near and yet so unfathomably transcendent. It was hard to look at him like a hero. But it was also almost impossible not to, even so. One could tell by his demeanor that he simply didn't a damn anymore, becoming a king. An emperor. A light to the masses, a hero to the many. He couldn't be bothered to care. Simeon's soul construct rose to his feet and quickly helped raise Raj and Drake to the feet. Placing them on the platform before putting it on his own back and respectfully waiting for Lionel, Lionel stepped forward without a word. Vanishing in the blink of an eye, Simeon rushed after him. Vanishing into the dark clouds above like an obedient servant, not long later. The clouds slowly began to disperse and the wrath of the emperor vanished as well. Lionel's descent had brought thunder and darkness, his departure gave way to rays of sunlight. And yet the ominous atmosphere still hung. Omnipresent and resilient, Lionel's brothers stood with their fists still clenched, their tears rolling down their cheeks. They already knew that the Lionel they knew was longer among them. Lionel stepped onto his flagship with an indifferent expression. His heart didn't have the slightest fluctuation and his breath remained steady, even after wiping out 4 families. Committing what could only be described as mass genocide. His steps didn't feel any heavier. His shoulders didn't feel any more burdensome. Speak. Lionel said indifferently. There was only one person he could be talking to. And that was, of course, Simeon. The reason Lionel didn't care about Simeon's so-called information was because he could get it out of him whenever he wanted. With a soul in his possession, he was essentially under control of everything this person had ever known, and the most fearsome part was that they had no ability to resist. In this state, Lionel's Emperor's charm was its absolute strongest and his charisma was on a completely different level. Not only were his soul constructs sentient, they were also endlessly loyal. He had heard of others who had necromancer-like abilities. But he didn't have to deal with the restrictions many of them did. Outside of the initial investment of Dream Force and his willpower, he didn't need to invest anything else if he didn't want to. He could take control of hundreds of seventh-dimensional existences with ease before he felt any sort of burden, and that was because much of the strength needed came from the original soul owner to begin with. Lionel's only job was to give the soul form and stop it from dissipating. In fact, he didn't even need to invest stamina into control as that was all done passively by his Emperor's charm. On top of that, if he really wanted to control them, he could, using his intelligence to make efficient use of their power. But in most cases, it was better to simply allow them to fight with their usual battle style, something they were the most familiar with. Of course, there were problems as well, these weaknesses coming from the fact that Lionel didn't have access to Emperor's Command, Breathe, and Emperor's Command, Assimilate. Currently, Lionel could only stop these souls from dissipating for a single day. After a 24-hour period, no matter what he did, even if he tried to use the Arise command again, it would be useless. This was why among the 7th-dimensional soul constructs he came with, he only had Aderna family members as they were the last he destroyed before he came back to Earth. If Lionel's assumption was correct, the Breathe command should be a method of tethering a soul to the real world on a more permanent basis. Without it, Lionel would always be limited in this way. In addition, as the soul constructs took damage, this 24-hour period was fed upon to reform it, thus cutting it down further. Depending on the damage, more time was lost. This was simply how things went. There was no technique or ability in existence without any drawbacks. Yes, Your Imperial Highness. My inferior self wanted to use information about the Brazinger family and the other great families as a bargaining chip. The first thing my inferior self wanted to let Imperial Highness know was that among the number killed, Your Imperial Highness Empress' worst enemy was not among them. The woman, Imperatrice Anselma, is hidden within a special realm of the Brazinger family. The second thing my inferior self wanted Imperial Highness to know is the existence of these special realms. The current showing of the great families is nothing more than the tip of the iceberg. This inferior servant status is lowly and does not know much else, but what this inferior servant does know is that there are certain rules and restrictions restraining the great families from acting as they please. Chapter 1765. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:03 and 59 seconds AM. Chapter 1765. Smoothly. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Where are these hidden realms? This servant does not know, Your Imperial Highness. Have you never been there? I have, Your Imperial Highness, and I can enter as I please. However, this method relies on my fleshly body and I will not be recognized in this state. You can enter freely but you do not know where it is? Correct, Your Imperial Highness. So long as I or any member of the great families had been within Earth's jurisdiction, we could enter. And why is it that you didn't use this method to escape when you couldn't escape from my hands? This lowly servant was unable to due to certain restrictions, Your Imperial Highness. The process requires time and can be easily interrupted by outside influences. Lionel could only lay down the killing intent in his heart for now. If there was no method, then it seemed that his killing spree would have to pause here, for now. If this lowly one might be presumptuous. Your Imperial Highness. Speak, Lionel said indifferently. somewhat knowing what Simeon wanted to say. This lowly servant is lowly even among the Brazingers. Lionel nodded to himself. He had already guessed this. Back when he faced the patrol leader, he had deduced that Simeon was far too weak for the kind of status he seemed to have. The reason this lowly servant was able to demand some prestige is because of who my father is. My father and siblings all command great strength within the Brazinger family. However, while my ability index is good, my body has always been weak, and I was thus tasked with overseeing things on the outside, and I was not privy to many secrets. However, this lowly servant does know some things. For example, the main family seems to have specifically bred the Brazingers on the outside to perform certain tasks. If this lowly one's understanding is correct, then Brazinger family members with a certain level of potency of lineage factor cannot exist the hidden realm. A step further than that. If this lowly one is correct, then the potency is decided by the level of Earth. The stronger Earth's territory becomes. The stronger members of the Brazinger family and other great families can make their presences known. As for why this is, this lowly one does not know or understand. But what this servant can tell your Imperial Highness is that the last time the great family sent out a large contingent was after Earth's sixth-dimensional evolution. They have yet to do so since Earth entered the seventh dimension because it was deemed unnecessary, with your Imperial Highness's actions. However, Simeon's soul construct froze, a wild ripple fluctuating through it and nearly causing it to collapse entirely, never to return. A malevolent aura rolled off of Lionel in waves. Good, he said in a soft voice that somehow caused the flagship to quake. The more they send, the better. My blade hasn't been satisfied yet. Simeon shivered, but his gaze was filled with fanaticism. If it wasn't because he knew well that his Imperial Highness was disgusted with him, he would have knelt down and kissed his feet. Imperial Highness will be sure to crush them all. Simeon roared out beside himself, supporting Lionel's momentum. The members of the Brazinger family are powerful, but they will be no match for your Highness. Lionel didn't respond to Simeon. He felt no need to. If the Brazingers they had sent out for the sixth-dimensional evolution of Earth were already so powerful, there was no need to talk about the kind of monsters they had in reserve. However, Lionel wanted them to come. Whether it was for Aina or his brothers, he hadn't let enough blood rain yet. Put them down, Lionel said coldly. Simeon hurried to follow Lionel's orders, placing the platform above his head on the ground carefully. Bring out the others. Simeon understood what Lionel meant without explanation, the benefit of a soul construct. Quickly, he brought Lionel's other brothers. As expected, he had gotten them all. Milan, Franco, and Gil came out and stood beside Raj and Drake, all of them having the very same dull gaze. This was exactly why Lionel had said that Simeon was lucky. If he hadn't done this, Lionel would have showed him just how cruel he could be. As far as Lionel was concerned, being burned alive was a show of mercy on his part. Under normal circumstances, Lionel would be helpless to do anything. However, because the corpses of his 4 brothers had been preserved and manipulated by Simeon, small portions of their souls were still present and had yet to dissipate. As a result, Lionel flipped over a palm and the silver tablet appeared. With this, he could bring the 5 of them back. If their souls had dissipated, even the silver tablet would be able to do nothing. But by a twist of fate, all thanks to Simeon's sadistic actions, his brothers had a chance. Rise, Lionel commanded. As Lionel yearned to bring his brothers back, news of his actions during the last few days finally began to circulate before they made it back to a particular man, Patriarch Guerreros, the leader of the chaotic water sector. He did what? Guerreros sat up entirely, his pupils constricted into pinholes. It took him a long time to calm down, his heart still beating erratically even in the end. But, he still maintained his rationality, remembering the kind of backing and trump cards he had in his hands. So he used the flagship to commit murder, correct? That's exactly the smoking gun we need. To think that I didn't need those schemes at all, he went and did it himself. Let Cross Elder Avens know that he can it personally. He doesn't need to touch Lionel at all, just retrieve the flagship, everything will be simple after that. Lionel had scanned the flagship from head to toe. There simply weren't any tracking devices, nor any methods of directly coming to him. But there was one failsafe that he couldn't see through even if he knew it was there, one hidden within its nuclear fusion core. Just probing the general vicinity was too difficult and could damage his soul, let alone if he tried to reach its hidden depths where this mechanism was hidden. Shield Cross Stars was a protector of humanity. They couldn't allow rogue officers to do as they pleased. As such, whenever one of their warships was used to kill, there was a method of marking down exactly what happened and relaying it to the Shield Cross Stars' upper management. This was meant to fight against corruption. In order to stop powerful officers who were often in control of such mechanisms from hiding their actions, the failsafe was tied to the power core itself. Every time an attack was powered, the core would register it. If a death was noted, it would be permanently recorded. The process of sending this information back to the Shield Cross Stars headquarters would reveal the position of the flagship, but most importantly, a Cross Elder would be able to act directly. This was exactly what Guerrero's wanted. Once this was done, the next step of Guerrero's plan would flow all too smoothly. Chapter 1766. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:03 and 57 seconds AM. Chapter 1766. Quake if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel's dream force surged, enveloping the puppet forms of his brothers. His face immediately went pale under the strain, compared to resurrecting a soul that had just fallen in this. The difficulty was several orders of magnitude separated. In that instant, Lionel didn't hesitate to purge the souls he still had under his control. They would only last for a few more hours regardless. Between that and his brothers, the answer was all too obvious. The only one he kept in his possession was Simeon because he still hadn't finished asking all the questions he needed to just yet. Slowly, Lionel extricated what remained of his brother's soul, slowly nurturing them to the point they became whole once more. But rather than taking the final step and giving them form, he brought the silver tablet forward. Lionel wasn't actually sure if this would work. From what he originally knew about the silver, it was only designed to be used with the zone in specific. He had tried to experiment with it before, but it had no reaction in the face of death. However, the Lionel of the past and the current Lionel were vastly different. Now, he could directly control soul, theoretically. The reaction the silver tablet had now should be different from the past, if the souls were provided to it, instead of just a normal corpse. There was no reason why it would react differently. With Lionel's current perspective, he knew that the constructs hidden within the silver tablet were actually just souls that the silver tablet was preserving. Somehow the silver tablet could replicate some of the abilities of the Emperor's might lineage factor, and seemingly with even far greater ease. It only made Lionel more curious as to the true origins of this tablet. Lionel's pupils suddenly constricted. He sensed it right then. The silver tablet had reached some sort of peak capacity. If he wanted to use it on his brothers, he would need to. Lionel hadn't expected this. The souls of his brothers had actually all reached the 7th dimension already, and this very clearly placed a great amount of strain on the silver tablet. In fact, Lionel had a feeling that this was probably the limit of the silver tablet. But this only made sense. Ana's father had a bronze tablet that seemingly had the exact same functions. There had to be something that separated them. And this seemed to be it. If Lionel was correct, the limit of the silver tablet was probably in preserving and resurrecting 7th-dimensional souls. Lionel's expression went cold. He knew his decision would kill the souls that remained in the silver tablet, but he didn't hesitate to make the choice. With a thought, he allowed his brother's souls into the silver tablet, causing large swaths of the remaining souls within to disperse one after another. Anastasia, convert the remaining resources into pure neutral chi. The remaining resources Lionel was referring to were the raw ores and force crystals he had managed to save in constructing his divine armors by making use of the abilities of the cleansing waters. He ended up needing less than half of the resources he had traded for back then, and now they would come in handy in bringing his brothers back to him. The segmented cube was still a finger sleeve on Lionel's hand, so it wasn't difficult for Lionel to access it and communicate with Anastasia. In just a few moments, a concentrated stream of pure energy began to emit from his finger, pouring into the silver tablet. Lionel watched with a gaze as steely as cool metal, his heartbeat steady. If this worked, then everything would be fine. If it didn't, he would show those so-called great families true pain. He didn't care what their true origin was. He would bury them all. The silver tablet trembled and 5 beams of light shot out, motes of light rotating and quickly taking form. Only when Lionel saw this did he breathe a slight breath of relief, but even then, there was still a hint of trepidation within him. It was one thing to bring the likes of Elthar or his King Oryx's father back to life. After all, Lionel didn't have much interaction with them. However, he was far more worried about this. What if they were no longer the same? Was life and death really so easy to play around with? And what about the state of the souls? What if the issues they had were due to this forced method he was using? With Lionel's speed of thought, he thought of dozens of potential issues per breath, and they only seemed to snowball into larger and larger problems until he stopped breathing entirely. One after another, the motes of light solidified into 5 bodies that slowly opened their eyes one after another. The 5 looked around and met each other's gazes first, seemingly in a daze. Raj blinked, locking eyes with Milan before he jumped so high his head nearly hit the ceiling, his rotund stomach rolling in waves. Fuck. Ghost. Ghost? Milan was confused for a second before he looked down at himself and then back up again. Suddenly, he felt enraged for no reason. Who the hell's the ghost? You're the ghost. Are you trying to curse me to death? Milan swiped at the air and jumping Raj suddenly found a bubble of force surrounding him. The bubble of force shook wildly, causing Raj to bounce around and end up too dizzy to see straight. Let me out, you ghost. Damn it. Raj roared and a strong surge of earth force shot out in all directions. Call me a ghost one more time, Jigglytubby. Fuck, you're here too, rabbit ears? Gil was so distracted by Raj and Milan that he only now noticed that Franco was right next to him. Why are you naked? Even if you want to be a pervert, there should be a limit, right? Franco was speechless before he suddenly mumbled to himself. Did I end up in the same fiery pit as this idiot? No way, I had more karma than that. Where's God? I have a few words for him. Which pair of eyes did he use to judge my life? What the fuck is this? Probably the same pair of eyes that saw you fuck Marcy's sister while she was downstairs having an argument with her parents about you, Gil jabbed back. He saw that and still put me here? That should have been in my highlight reel. Drake was the most silent of them all, but when he looked around and his eyes landed on Lionel, they couldn't help but open wide. Captain. The sudden yell snapped them all awake and their heads snapped toward Lionel all at once. Lionel was stunned for a moment as well before he suddenly burst into a laughter that rocked the entire flagship. He laughed so hard that tears threatened to spill from his eyes. Other than his brothers, who else would react like this after snubbing death? They didn't even waste any time before they were suddenly at each other's throats. They didn't even notice his presence. Just when Lionel wanted to say something more, the entire flagship quaked, but this time, he was sure it had nothing to do with his laughter. Chapter 1767. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:03 and 57 seconds AM. Chapter 1767. Change if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Lionel and his brothers looked up all at once. Their expressions turning cold all at once. Lionel was immediately infuriated. His brothers had just come back to him, and yet instead of having some time to catch up, some fool who didn't know better was already threatening them. There didn't seem to be even a single moment of rest for him. The 6 brothers' gazes met and they all shot toward the outside of the flagship all at once, nothing really caring about their clothing. Even the most clothed among them, Lionel, was practically naked given the ragged state of his clothing. None of this, though, was able to slow their steps when they made it outside. Lionel's pupils constricted. The force barrier protecting the flagship was already in a heavily damaged state, seemingly just an attack or two away from collapsing entirely. In the skies, an old man with a fluttering mustache. Just seeing him, Lionel felt his heart palpitate. This man was the strongest existence he had ever been so close to. The difference was so large that it felt as though an oppressive mountain was weighing down on his shoulders. However, even while Lionel was thinking this, the expression of Cross Elder Avon was incredibly ugly. It should have taken him only a single strike to pierce through the barrier. But he had already attacked twice and yet it was still up. What the hell was going on? Of course. In order to enter Earth's territory, Avin had to suffer a suppression of his strength. After all, he wasn't an earthling. Nor was he born in any of the territories it had recently swallowed up, however. Shield Cross Stars had fail-safe measures to deal with situations like this. The badge on his hip currently was designed to directly shut down the flagship and strip its control away from Lionel. With this badge, it should have only taken him a single strike to pierce through its defenses and the attacks of the flagship would be useless against him. And yet things had clearly not worked out properly. Cross Elder Avin realized at that moment that if the badge didn't work on the force barrier, then didn't that mean that it wouldn't work in protecting him against the flagship's attacks as well? Lionel's gaze narrowed. His fragmented Bao domain lineage factor immediately activating as he locked eyes with the badge. He noticed its oddities almost immediately. Lionel had seen through a lot of the countermeasures of Shield Cross Stars and he had undone them all, or so he thought. The fact a single seventh-dimensional existence could crack the force barrier like this must mean that his countermeasures weren't as perfect as he thought. The energy core. Lionel immediately deduced the issue. He had turned the entire flagship on its head and he had a perfect replica of each one of its individual parts down to the small bolt. There was only one location where such a countermeasure could possibly be hidden, the nuclear fusion core. Toward this, Lionel was helpless to do anything. Modifying that region was too dangerous. There's a chance that this old man has more strength than what he's showing as well. And if that's true, Lionel's expression turned cold and he waved a hand. In that moment, the number of clones he had in the flagship more than tripled, in an instant. The cannons aimed in the skies and pulsed. Prepare to fire, fuck. Cross Elder Avin's eyes widened. When he heard that Lionel was able to precision aim the cannons of the flagship to target individuals on a one-person scale, he had found it ridiculous. The flagship was designed to aim at other warships, asteroids, and planets. The margin for error was too large to think of aiming for a single person. Doing so was like trying to use a blow dart to kill a fly from 100 kilometers away. Such a level of precision was simply impossible, especially not when the target could move. So why did Avin suddenly feel the scent of death? Boom! The cannons unleashed and Cross Elder Avin roared, slapping his palms together and allowing a tsunami of force to envelop him from all sides. Lionel's gaze narrowed. This was the same ability index that Milan had, the Energy Shield Ability Index. But at this level, it was a completely different monster. Boom! The man was swallowed whole by the beams of blinding light as the starry skies illuminated. Lionel's eyes narrowed. The power is only 10% of what it should be. As expected, the core of it all is in the nuclear fusion core. It's been compromised. Somehow, the energy that comes from it is being mutated, disallowing it from harming those with that badge. If not for the modifications I made, it wouldn't have even have 10% left. As the beam cleared, Cross Elder Avin appeared, shielded behind a mighty force barrier that almost looked corporeal. It floated with runes dancing across its surface. It truly seemed as though it was alive. Cross Elder Avin's fiery temper threatened to spill over, plumes of fire flickering within the depths of his eyes. His barrier quaked slightly, but there wasn't a single crack on it. It was clear that he had weathered its strength without much issue. If not for him being caught off guard by the rumors being true, he wouldn't have been flustered in the first place. However, in the time it took him to form his defenses, the cracked barriers of the flagship had recovered. Lionel stood with a cold expression, his mind churning. He didn't actually believe that his father's threat would give him some omnipresent and omnidirectional protection. However, he was still somewhat shocked that someone would dare to attack him so openly like this, and especially while he was so close to Earth. In addition, this person seemed to be from Shield Cross Stars. How bold. Something's changed, there must be something this person is relying on. If not, why not just use the Patriarch of the Chaotic Water Sector to find my location and use that badge to take me out much earlier? Why wait until now? Unless, who the hell are you? Lionel asked coldly. Chapter 1768. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:03 and 54 seconds AM. Chapter 1768. Blame if audio player doesn't work. Press stop then play button again. Cross Elder Avin's expression wasn't good being questioned by a junior so rudely. He didn't expect to be placed in this situation to begin with. According to his original intentions, he would have already been on the flagship by now. Teaching Lionel a lesson, he would have conveniently taken the opportunity to capture Lionel back, but now. Your Imperial Highness, this man should be Cross-Elder Avon of Shield Cross Stars. His status is very high. He is an 8th dimensional expert and he can almost make unilateral decisions in regards to the movements of Shield Cross Stars. At that moment, Simeon's soul construct suddenly spoke, causing Lionel's gaze to narrow even further. As he had expected, Cross-Elder Avon was a true powerhouse. The human domain didn't have any 8th dimensional worlds. As such, any 8th dimensional experts usually had to use methods of restricting their own strength just to be able to stay in their homes. In addition, just crossing the barrier to the 8th dimension to begin with was a huge test in and of itself because it required leaving the human domain to succeed. The fact that Cross-Elder Avon had succeeded not only gave him exceptionally high status among Shield Cross Stars, but also among humans in general. The human race truly didn't have many experts of this caliber. The number was less than 100 in comparison to their population of trillions upon trillions. Lionel didn't bother to care about why Simeon knew of this for now. He would deal with one problem at a time. Dealing with such an expert would require his full attention. The first time Lionel met a 7th dimensional expert as a 5th dimensional expert himself was during his interaction with Wise Star Order. Back then, he had been entirely outclassed. Although Cross-Elder Avon was restricted, there was no telling what kind of abilities he had. If not for the flagship, Lionel would have already been in his clutches. Brat, I would advise you hand over the flagship and obediently hand yourself in. Cap, this old man's more annoying than Coach. Look at the mustache. Is it a rite of passage for you legion of stick-up-the-ass old men to all have rats on your lips? Raj scoffed. At least Coach isn't bald. No wonder this old man's so jaded. Raj had no idea what had happened, nor did he understand the context. But he didn't care, even in the worst case that Lionel was in the wrong. He would just turn a blind eye. The moment he saw that mustache, he was already having flashbacks to running sprints under the beaming sun and he lashed out. Lionel, who was trying to be serious, couldn't help but smile. Cross-Elder Avon's expression turned malevolent. He couldn't remember the last time someone had dared to talk to him like this, just as he was about to say something. A swirling portal of green gold appeared in the skies. Lionel's eyes widened. At that moment, a middle-aged man wearing robes embroidered with coiling 5-clawed dragons stepped out. His hands were clasped behind his back, his expression indifferent and unmoved as he appeared before Cross-Elder Avon. Now that Lionel thought about it, this was the first time he had ever seen his grandfather upright, let alone moving. Every time they had met, he was either sitting in meditation or seated on a throne. And the difference, it was striking. Emperor Fox every movement seemed to cause the laws of the world to shimmer and bend, even the dragons on his imperial robes seeming far more alive. Without a word, Emperor Fox stood just a single meter from Cross-Elder Avon. The difference in their height was striking, with Avon being a full head shorter, although much stockier. Emperor Fox's head suddenly turned and he looked toward Earth that loomed in the nearby distance. It seemed that he was checking if he wasn't crazy. Indeed, his imperial palace was within sight, and yet this person had still come here, in his territory, to stir trouble. Emperor Fox's head turned back toward Cross-Elder Avon. Leave, Emperor Fox said lightly. His robes fluttered as he looked down toward Avon, the lack of wind seemingly not mattering in the slightest. You. Avon's eyes widened with fury. However, before he could speak, a blinding gold light appeared to Emperor Fox's back as a scroll slowly unfurled. I said, leave. The entirety of Earth's territory trembled and Lionel's eyes opened wide. In the blink of an eye, Cross-Elder Avon's vanished to places seemingly unknown. And yet Lionel was absolutely certain that he was exported out of Earth's territory entire with a single spoken word. His grandfather's range of control was so large. Emperor Fox casually turned back toward Lionel, his expression indifferent. Don't you have a job to do? Get to it. Emperor Fox didn't seem to care to mention the massacre of the Brazingers that had occurred just moments ago. With a step, he vanished. Lionel fell into silence, his expression serious. So Shield Cross Stars could find him if he used the flagship to kill, but that didn't change much. Somehow, the chaotic water sector was able to do the same thing. The real problem was that they had methods of weakening his flagship's power output and its defenses. If they really wanted to cause issues, just handing such methods to those causing trouble in Earth's territory would make the situation far more dangerous. Cross-Elder Avens flashed out of the void, his body sliding back in the depths of space until he came to a grinding halt. His clothing was disordered and his mustache bristled, a hint of shock in the depths of his eyes. He still couldn't quite wrap his head around what had just happened. This was supposed to be easy, just what had happened? Fury built up within his chest with nowhere to be vented. Good. 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 Then don't blame me, then. Chapter 1769. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:03 and 53 seconds AM. Chapter 1769. May if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Lionel stood in silence for a moment before he looked around with a smile. The weight in his chest seemed to have been lowered somewhat. He didn't even care to consider what had happened in the last few days. He just felt content at the moment. His only regret was that his brothers had actually gone through so much growing without him. In this time, they had actually gone ahead and stepped into the seventh dimension well before him. This wasn't too surprising, though, given the talent of the people of Earth, not to mention the sheer number of resources Earth and its surrounding planets were spewing out constantly. It wasn't too shocking that they could reach such a stage relying on the conventional path, although it was slightly regretful that they hadn't taken the God path. Lionel could tell that they didn't have much of a choice in the matter. When Lionel last met them, they were only at the lower tiers of the fifth dimension. Between then and now, Earth had faced several existential crises. It wasn't as though they could take their time to grow in such a situation. Emno was definitely far luckier in this regard. Even so, as Lionel had learned long ago, taking the conventional path didn't guarantee one's weakness. If they reforged their foundations with the help of the demon corpses as well, their chances at squeezing out their full potential would skyrocket. Plus, the root of talent that separated the people of Earth from others came not from their base dimension, but rather their ability indexes. And from what Lionel could tell from their casual jokes from earlier, his brothers had refined their ability indexes to a shocking degree. Lionel's expression flickered for a moment and he vanished for a moment. When he reappeared, there were 3 more young men standing with him, all 3 of whom carried confused expressions until their eyes suddenly widened. Joel, Arnold and Alan weren't as wild with their reactions as the others would be. But even so, it took everything in them not to scream out, "Ghost," as well. Ah! Raj charged over and swept the 3 into a bear hug before they could react. The 3 couldn't even react. Their minds still ringing. Was this an illusion? Had they slipped into such a thing? It wasn't impossible. But hadn't they been in human territory? Unless that was an illusion too. It wasn't until they felt Raj's members swinging against their legs that they snapped out of it. Damn it, Raj. Put on some damn clothes. Joel suddenly roared, pushing away and taking 3 hurried steps back. Raj burst into laughter, his stomach jiggling, his hips gyrated as he rushed after Joel. His entire body seemed to roll in a circular pattern, the sickening slapping noise of skin echoing through the flagship. Don't run, Joel. You're hurting my feelings. Don't you love me? Fuck. Joel turned and booked it. Ever since he and Lionel got caught sleeping in each other's arms and got themselves printed onto a t-shirt, he had been trying his best to avoid moments like this. All his usual composure flew out of the window, and yet, even as he ran, his eyes turned red as a wild grin spread across his face. It took a while, but the brothers finally sat together once more, circling around a table with smiles on their faces. Really though, Cap, when'd you become a god? I'm kinda scared, Franco asked. Ah. Lionel scratched his head. Honestly, he was only 20% sure that his method would work. The greatest limitation he had thought the silver tablet had was that its resurrection ability would only work on the zone, but he had never thought that he would gain the ability to manipulate souls, which allowed him to circumvent that method. The only limitation he had to contend with now was the 7th dimension. It was a bit unfortunate that so many lives were permanently lost to give his brothers a chance to live again, but Lionel knew he would make the same choice again even if it was presented to him once more. It was no longer that difficult of a choice to him. Lionel didn't really know how to explain it, so he just laid out everything honestly. After his brothers heard the truth, they looked toward one another. Didn't that mean that so long as they had enough energy to exchange and their souls didn't disperse, they would be basically immortal until they died of natural causes? Of course, Lionel would have to stay alive since he was the only one who could manipulate souls, but this was definitely a game changer. And they couldn't enter the 8th dimension, or else the silver tablet wouldn't be able to withstand their resurrection process. But this. It feels different from that as well, Drake suddenly said. He was the most conscientious of them all, so he noticed almost immediately. After I entered the 7th dimension, I felt like my progress had slowed to a crawl, but now it feels like all sorts of bottlenecks were suddenly opened up. Lionel's eyes flickered. This wasn't too surprising. The other ability of the silver tablet was clearing bottlenecks and allowing faster progression. After it rebuilt their bodies, it seemed that it had given them a path forward to progress faster as well. They were all in Tier 1 of the 7th dimension. In fact, even after many years, Joel, Arnold and Alan were only in Tier 2. But now, it seemed that there was another chance for them. Unfortunately, we don't have much time to tease out the details of right now. You guys must know that Earth is in a bit of trouble right now, some of which may or may not have been caused by me. Lionel rubbed his nose. The 9 brothers looked toward one another before bursting into a fit of laughter. May? A lot of it was definitely caused by Lionel, but did it matter? They were in this together. Chapter 1770. Published at 10th of April 2023 11:03 and 52 seconds AM. Chapter 1770. Big news: if audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Earth's territory, Etching Metal Organization. The situation in the Etching Metal Organization had been tense several days ago until the return of Emna, whereupon a shocking change took place. However, after this change settled down, the tension returned. This matter was inevitable. Emna, who had a high position in the hearts of the Etching Metal Organization, had placed her life on the line to give them a chance at the information they were seeking out, but even after returning in success, she had nothing to show for it, according to Emna. The impetus for the creation of their organization. A certain Lionel Morales that most of them had never even met before. Took the spoils of Emna's successful assassination to analyze himself. It was then said that he was meant to return to them in a few days. But even after that time period had passed, he had still not returned. Days ago, after Emna's return, many had already been dissatisfied with this. They didn't even know this Lionel. What right did he have to take their spoils? And now that he truly hadn't appeared after all this time, their dissatisfaction was only raised to an entirely new level. Could it be that he had simply lied and never planned to return at all? Everything came to a head and the commotion was raised to a large enough level that a meeting was forced to convene, at that moment, in an unknown location on an equally as unknown planet. This meeting had begun. The Etching Metal Organization had just one leader, Raylion, however. The power was dispersed across many heads, all of whom had their own thoughts, while there were some heads that Raylion could trust to be on his side, like Hephaestus, Emna, and the most powerful among them, Sale. When Lionel last met Sale, he had lamented that her mentality wasn't strong enough to make use of her talent, despite being more talented than even Raylion. During their time in Valiant Heart Mountain, she had been constantly suppressed by him. And after Valiant Heart Mountain fell, while Raylion was able to forge ahead, she found herself broken and weak. Since then, however, Sale had managed to pick herself up, becoming a backbone of the organization and a large reason why the original foundation of the Etching Metal Organization hadn't lost sight of their original purpose. Sale was precisely the very woman that had introduced Lionel and Aina to Valiant Heart Mountain in the first place. She had been born with a unique ability index that had never been encoded before that gave her body a great mutation that amplified her battle prowess. It also happened to give her quite some control over plants and vegetation. Raylion had started the Etching Metal Organization with Hephaestus many years ago, but it wasn't until quite some time after that Sale managed to find her way back to them, and finally, many years after that, she and Raylion finally knocked down the last barriers separating the two and became husband and wife, solidifying their control over the organization. Wink with a frown. Author's note. It's been a while, so I know the nuances of this relationship are probably hard to remember. If it matters to you, To remember and not just have it retold to you, I would suggest reading the last few chapters before the fall of Valiant Heart Mountain again, as these details will be more important than they seem. Chap 915 to 19. Anywho, back to the story. Still, over the years, in order to expand the power of the etching metal organization, Raylion had no choice but to recruit and delegate power. For an organization that lingered in the shadows and collected information while working in the morally gray hues of the world, being able to form numerous limbs that could work independently of one another while maintaining a certain level of strength and quality was greatly important. However, in order to accomplish this, one also had to accept working with a double-edged sword. In releasing some of the absolute control he had, Raylion had to swallow a lot more pushback and dissenting opinions, especially in recent days. It was to the point where many were questioning the original reason the organization was formed in the first place. Due to this, the room was split down the middle in two. On one side, there was Raylion, Sale, Alphestus and Emna, but on the other, there were four other individuals. Crafter Bittner. This old man was the best crafter among their numbers, being at the silver grade. He was very much responsible for outfitting a large number of their assassins, warriors and operatives with the tools and treasures they needed, especially at the highest levels. Treasurer Xianxia. He was a savant when it came to not only accounting, but also in money laundering and moving around dark money. Without him, their growth would have been bottlenecked over a decade ago. How could an organization grow without money? But this was an especially tall task to fulfill for an organization that functioned in the dark like theirs, especially when Raylion refused to take on casual assassination missions that would have been the most lucrative. Then there was Robin and Tiny, the former being a woman and the latter being a man that was, quite frankly, tiny. Robin was a tall and muscular woman whose neck was swallowed up by her traps, while Tiny was a man of not even 5 feet tall who had irises so large and black that the whites of his eyes almost vanished entirely. However, their combat prowess was exceptional and they were the pillars of strength of their organization outside of Raylion, Sale, Alphestus and Emna. At this moment, Crafter Bittner, Treasurer Xianxia, Robin and Tiny sat across from the four somewhat founding members of the organization, questioning the recent happenings quite fiercely. This old narrative is getting tiring, Tiny spoke in a voice several octaves too deep given his size. It has been over 20 years since the organization was founded and we've been waiting for this so-called Lionel to appear for all this time, and once he finally does, he screws us over? Is this what you've had us waiting all this time for? You refuse to expand beyond Earth's territory even though this is by far the most dangerous region to do business in the human domain currently. You refuse to accept assassination missions that aren't hand-picked and curated even though Xianxia is barely keeping us afloat money-wise. And now our apparent savior is some Tier 1 6th-dimensional brat? Emna's expression darkened. Tier 1 of the 6th dimension is too weak for you? Am I too weak for you too? We've already had this conversation, Emna. You dealt the man a fatal blow and he was already greatly weakened. He just swooped in after you had already done all the work and you went googly-eyed, even giving him our spoils of war. Shouldn't you be answering for that? I put my life on the line to complete that mission, but you want me to give you an answer for it? Emna's gaze danced with flickering blade lights. Haha. Tiny roared with laughter. You might have completed the mission, but who gave you the information on where that convenience station was? Who got the information of what that man's status was and what his goals were? How many of our brothers and sisters died before we could gather up that information? We've been in business for more than 20 years but we've only unearthed 3 of those locations, and yet you pissed it all away the moment you saw that incompetent fool. Now there's only 2 left and they'll probably be on guard. There's no telling if the information would remain the same, and even if it did, there's no telling if you'll succeed this time. If you can't see the problem with that, you don't deserve your position. You. Emna's hair stood on end, blade edges dancing within it. It seemed as though her individual strands had become blade force. Just as the atmosphere was about to boil over, there was a rushed knocking and an attendant stumbled in. Big news. Big news. Our informants just reported that the Aderna, Brazinger, Lavis and Crutus families have all been destroyed. Through their huffing and puffing, the attendant managed to breathe these words out. The 8 heads were left stunned. Chapter 1771. Published at 14th of April 2023 11:29 and 35 seconds AM. Chapter 1771. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1771. Interesting analysis. A silence fell over the group as the report settled in. They were first and foremost an information network. It could be said that they were definitely among the very first to get this information, and yet, rather than information trickling in one at a time, they actually got it all at once. They didn't even get any information about any armies setting in. What the hell happened? P Alpha and D Alpha. No one. Oh, Tiny stood to his feet, his shock making his heart palpitate. This was the kind of information they should have gotten even before it happened. How could a force hide from them for so long? It made their hearts run cold. Raylion, who had been completely silent all the while, suddenly narrowed his eyes, but at the moment, his gaze was actually focused on Tiny. Not the messenger. It was hard to tell what was going on in his mind. His expression just as cold and indifferent as usual, at the same time. Hephaestus, who had likewise been silent, slowly released his grip on the dagger by his side. Tiny seemed to have no idea just how close Hephaestus was from exploding. It could even be said that the messenger stopped things from getting overblown. There. The attendant took heaving breaths, trying to calm themselves, in order to get this information here. They had really gone all out. There was little information about the first three. But according to our informants near Earth, a Prince Lionel of the Ascension Empire appeared with a flagship of shield cross stars and wiped them out single-handedly. At this point, even Raylion's expression changed somewhat. Was this a coincidence? Prince Lionel? Suddenly, things slid into place one by one. The Lionel they knew was an heir of the Morales family. But if he was also a prince of the Ascension Empire, things would make much more sense. In fact, had they known this beforehand, a lot of the trouble their organization had gone through would have never festered to begin with. The Morales were simply too far away from their location. And because Raylion wanted to focus their attention on Earth's empire, the information they had on the outside was limited. As such, the prestige the Morales had in the hearts of their members was far too low for what they were, in comparison. The prestige of the four families and the Ascension Empire, in addition to certain other families and faiths, were much higher. They had known that Lionel was from Earth, but they hadn't known what kind of status he had on Earth. If they were aware, maybe things would have never devolved to this state. Prince Lionel? Tiny and the other three who weren't very familiar with Lionel to begin with didn't immediately make the connection. The human domain was too vast. How could some people not share names? Plus, the Lionel Emna and the others were referring to had the Morales last name, not Fox, which they associated with the imperial family. However, they froze when the attendant confirmed. Yes, a Prince Lionel Morales. He is the son of Princess Eleanor Morales. There is news from the wider human domain that the reason for the sudden activity of the underground networks of shield cross stars is because Princess Eleanor was infuriated by SCS labeling her son as a Tier 1 fugitive. Tiny forgot to breathe, his head slowly turning toward Emna and the others. Was this attendant trying to say that the Tier 1 six-dimensional existence he had just been lambasting wiped out four families their organization had no method to take head-on? Hephaestus suddenly laughed. That bastard is just as annoying as I remember. He pretends to be such a good person, and then he turns around and wipes out four families. It was his fault Valiant Heart Mountain fell so quickly too, but he just patted his ass and shrugged at that too. Raylion's gaze flickered as Sale's own danced with a complicated expression. Hephaestus wasn't wrong. For a long time, Sale felt guilty because it was she who invited Lionel to Valiant Heart Mountain to begin with. If not for what happened back then, they could have survived a few more centuries at least. They could have even used Earth's evolution as a method of turning their fate around. After all, they had been in Earth's quadrant to begin with, so they would have been the first to benefit. But in the end, things hadn't worked out that way. Emna was the most shocked among them all because she knew exactly what had caused this. She could still remember Lionel's rage when she informed him of what happened to his brothers. She even remembered hoping that he didn't do anything stupid. To think that he would get his revenge in just a few days, so quickly that even they were late to react. It took a while, but Tiny, Robin, and the other two finally calmed, looking toward one another. Tiny eventually took a seat as well, his expression flickering intermittently. He couldn't seem to decide what he should be thinking. Emna looked up, her own gaze cold. Do you have anything else to say now, Tiny? Tiny took a breath and exhaled, but before he could respond, it was actually Treasurer Jemsi who answered first. Do you all think that this concludes things? He suddenly said. Jemsi wasn't one to speak often, his eyes were usually glazed behind a pair of glasses. It seemed as though he was always calculating something, as though the outside world was of no interest whatsoever. However, the moment he did speak, everyone looked toward him. He is already a Tier 1 fugitive, and now he's used Shield Cross Star's weaponry to wipe out not just one, but 4 families of Earth. If his only identity was that of a prince of the Ascension Empire, things would be fine. However, his last name is Morales, not Fox. I'm sure if you all take a moment to think about it, you'll see what the problem is. Suddenly, due to his actions, competition over Earth's main resources have all been eradicated. It won't just be Shield Cross Stars that's unhappy about this. Interesting analysis. The sudden voice came from nowhere. This time, it wasn't just Tiny who stood to his feet, wary gazes looking toward the entrance. Chapter 1772. Published at 14th of April 2023 11:29 and 36 seconds AM. Chapter 1772. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1772. 2 choices. Lionel and his brothers slowly walked into the meeting room, Lionel himself at the helm. They seemed to appear from nowhere, and they hadn't even alerted anyone until they spoke toward this. Even Emna was surprised. She had told Lionel how to find them, but she hadn't expected him to enter the depths of their territory without anyone even noticing. The attendant was deathly pale. The moment Lionel stopped hiding his presence, the pressure was suffocating. Even Jemsi, who always maintained his calm, felt his throat constrict. Suddenly, the pressure vanished as Lionel grinned. Long time no see. Lionel laughed as he looked toward Hephaestus, Raylion and Sale. It couldn't be said that he had a deep relationship with all 3 of them, but he had good impressions of Sale, although she was a bit naive. At the same time, he quite respected Raylion. As for Hephaestus, he respected him as well, if for nothing other than his loyalty to Raylion. Suddenly, Lionel felt a vicious wind assault him, even as it pierced toward his throat. An afterimage of Hephaestus slowly dissipated into the wind. A malicious intent swallowing him up whole. Shing. Shying. Clang. Boom. P alpha and D alpha. No one. Oh, wild winds spread in all directions. Strong blade forces lashing out against the walls of the meeting room and leaving deep grooves everywhere they passed. Lionel's clothing fluttered, his fingers raised in a pinching motion. Between them, a blade was stopped mere inches from his neck, an amused light in his eye. Hephaestus' forearm bulged with wiggling veins that pulsed like flood dragons. His face went red beneath the strain. But he couldn't move forward even a single inch. What's this? Hephaestus? You aren't happy to see me? How's your diet been? Were you so weak? Hephaestus' lip twitched before he snorted and pulled back his blade. Hiding his trembling wrist to his back, he was already in Tier 9 of the 6th dimension. But his all-out attack had actually been stopped by 2 fingers, while he hadn't used his ability index. That was still at least 50% of his strength in that single assault. The fact Lionel had stopped it so casually went to show the sheer gap between them. My diet? Hephaestus snorted. I went easy on you, consider this a welcome gift. Lionel laughed. He remembered Hephaestus' ability index quite well. He could gain the characteristics of what he ate. The trouble was that the more talent he wanted to extract, and the more talented his target, the more of it he needed, for someone like Hephaestus. Especially since he left the evolution of the tentacle womb up to Anastasia. He probably had the highest ceiling of anyone here outside of Emna, who was only a measure away from forging her own path. All Lionel had to do was feed him a large number of demon corpses. Lionel looked towards Sale and blinked. Maybe not. Lionel hadn't expected that Emna wouldn't be the only one who was a real spark here. To think that Sale would be a real spark too, it was quite ironic. The original strongest amongst them, Raylion, actually seemed to have the least potential now. However, when Lionel looked into Raylion's eyes, he could see the very same fire he had seen back then. He might not have gotten the same opportunities as the rest of them, but his heart is still firm. That is more than worthy of praise. Lionel nodded toward Raylion lightly. For a man like this, he didn't need to say anything more. Raylion didn't need thanks, the only acknowledgement he needed were the fruits of his labor blooming, and Lionel would make certain that that happened. After Lionel greeted the 4 heads he was familiar with one by one, he finally turned his attention toward the remaining 4. They were all looking toward him with gazes ranging from wary to somewhat curious. I don't have much time to stay here today because there are still 3 major incidents that I was delayed from handling, but I can say that this man here isn't wrong. There will indeed be trouble for my actions, but the real question is how much it matters to you. Before you, there are 2 options. One is obedience, the other is death. There is no third option. Which will you choose? Lionel's smile vanished, his oppressive aura returning. The 4 suddenly felt small. Their force was sluggish and their breathing labored. Suddenly, they realized that Lionel wasn't alone. The aura of 8 seventh-dimensional powerhouses flooded the room and their eyes opened wide. It was only at that moment that Emna realized that 5 men that should have been dead were standing before her safe and sound. Treasurer Xianxia took deep breaths, trying to calm himself. You are very strong, but have you truly thought about this? This will no longer be a matter of just shield cross stars. Your actions are an opportunity for almost every family of the human domain to stick their noses into the matters of Earth. I don't need you to explain these things to me. If you can think of it, I thought of it 100 times faster. You may be used to being the smartest person in the room, but I can tell you now that your greatest pride is useless before me. I won't repeat myself again. Make your choice, Lionel said coldly. Ha! Treasurer Xianxia chuckled. Do I really have a choice at all? I don't want to die. Good, Lionel said indifferently. At that moment, a mighty golden light raised up behind him, a radiant scroll unfurling. Lionel's gaze glowed with a fierce light and he pierced out his finger 4 times in a row. The 4 heads shuddered. Although they couldn't see it, in each of their ethereal glabellas, they had all gained an imperial edict. So long as they dared to disobey it, the ethereal glabellas would self-destruct. This ability was a fusion of Emperor's Gaze and Emperor's Edict known as Emperor's Mark. Lionel had deduced it on his own without the Emperor's Might tablet because his comprehension of its 2 halves were absolutely perfect. This would also make certain things far more convenient for him. Now, like I said, I don't have much time. The 3 most pressing issues are the Zoltine Faith, the Thrusting Skies sector and the re-emergence of the Viola family. I need information about these 3 as things don't seem so simple. Chapter 1773. Published at 14th of April 2023 11:29 and 36 seconds AM. Chapter 1773. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1773. Glorious Zolti. Not long later, Lionel left with his brothers, leaving a few words for the etching metal organization. He saw no reason not to trust Raylion and the others. While he placed his Emperor's Mark on Xianxia and the other 3 heads, there was no way he would do the same to the 4 founding heads. It seems we didn't waste our time, Hephaestus said. After a long while, he had a wild grin on his face. He remembered the first time he met Lionel. He could have beaten him any time he wanted, but just months later, he was already incapable of lasting a few blows, and now, decades later, to say that Lionel could defeat him with a single strike wasn't giving Lionel enough credit. P Alpha D Alpha. No one. Raylion didn't say anything to this. But he felt Sale's small hand slip into his own, while Raylion didn't show any sort of emotion. Sale understood him the best. There was no one here who wanted this result more than Raylion himself. Even as they all surpassed Raylion one after another, Sale knew that Raylion had never given up on becoming a powerful expert. Unfortunately, his talent was just lacking in comparison to the others. He had gone from the head disciple of Valiant Heart Mountain to ultimately being an administrative leader of the organization. Raylion knew that if he wanted to achieve his dreams, Lionel was his only hope, but his pride was far too deep. He refused to hold his hands out, hoping that Lionel would just do him a favor. He had no relationship with Lionel, and they had even once been enemies. And even if they had been friends, Raylion would never feel comfortable asking for something when he could give nothing in return. During these over 20 years he had put his blood, sweat and tears into this organization, doing everything he could so that he could look Lionel in the eyes and exchange not for his charity, but for what he deserved. he had spent every waking moment thinking and dreaming on. This day, his effort would finally pay off. Raylion squeezed Sale's hand lightly and his gaze turned toward Tiny. Tiny, he said lightly. Tiny, whose expression was ugly after being essentially branded like cattle by Lionel, suddenly snapped awake when he met Raylion's gaze. For some reason, he felt his heart skip a beat. He had always subconsciously feared this man, but he never truly understood why. What did they promise you? Tiny? Tiny froze before quickly recovering. What are you talking about, Raylion? The 4 families, what did they promise you? Raylion replied just as calmly, his eyes even being half closed. Hearing this, Tiny turned entirely pale. He wanted to refuse it, but when he remembered the Emperor's mark hovering in his ethereal glabella, he knew that there was no longer any point. Raylion must have been sitting on this information for a long time waiting for the perfect opportunity, but since Lionel had appeared, he didn't have to be subtle and sly with everything anymore. This was the difference between scheming and true strength. Tiny could do nothing in the face of Lionel's overwhelming means. Tiny grit his teeth. I will give you all the information and benefits I received. Good, Raylion replied lightly. You have 3 days. I assume with this that we will see a 150% boost in revenue and the effectiveness of our network. Since we won't be shooting ourselves in the foot anymore, I expect us to be in peak form within the week in time for Lionel's return. Raylion stood to his feet, holding on to Sale's hand. Our goal is beyond this. Very soon we will be on the world stage. As the founder of the Etching Metal organization, I officially announce that our first growth phase has come to an end. Our goal of becoming the best information network of the human domain has been successful. Our next goal is as follows: to make Lionel Morales the official heir of the Morales family. The teleportation formation flashed and a group of 9 appeared. Lionel looked around and sighed. What's wrong, Cap? Drake asked. Lionel rubbed his forehead. I didn't have time to make us any cool uniforms. Lionel's 8 brothers looked toward one another speechlessly for a moment before bursting into a fit of laughter. Raj wrapped his arm around Lionel's shoulder and trudged forward with big strides. Cap, if you can make me a uniform that makes the ladies realize that this is the true peak masculine form, I'll get Milan to give you a foot rub. Raj's big belly rolled with his laughter. As far as he was concerned, clothing designers were the real people screwing him over. The group walked out laughing, seemingly not realizing that they had a tall task ahead of them. They appeared on a barren moon to stare down at a planet, or at the very least, it was what should have been a planet, but was instead a temple the size of one. This place was none other than the headquarters of the Zoltene faith. According to reports, this faith had recently been making an aggressive push in Earth's territory, forcefully seizing offerings and spreading their shrines even in areas where there was no consent on the part of the inhabitants. Lionel could see the various clergymen of the Zoltene faith walking around. They all wore robes that flickered with holographic images that changed depending on the angle you saw them at. There didn't seem to be any rhyme or reason to the flickering colors, although there was probably some mysterious ranking system associated with it. Still, the most prominent part were the large glass orbs they wore like head ornaments. It seemed to be blown with different colored pieces of glass, flickering with a rainbow-like assortment of colors. More than their odd robes, this was the true marker of a worshipper of the Zoltene god. Let's go, Lionel said after observing for a while. With a leap, he shot forward on his black surfboard, streaking through the skies with his brothers to his back with their own flying treasures. Halt. This is the territory of the glorious Zoltene. Halt. Stop. The 9 brothers didn't seem to hear any of this in the slightest as they directly barged in, their speed even faster than usual. Chapter 1774. Published at 14th of April 2023 11:29 and 36 seconds AM. Chapter 1774. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1774. So was Lionel. Powerful warriors converged from all sides, however Lionel didn't lift a single finger. It was Drake who suddenly flipped over his palms, causing 2 silver pistols to appear. Without waiting for any signal, he began to fire. With every pull of his trigger, another clergyman was shot out of the skies. Although he didn't immediately kill any of them, they found themselves crippled at best. some of them even being shoved toward death's door. The group crossed the barrier of the temple, entering the highest floor directly. There should have been force art protections, but Lionel and the others seemed to slip right through them as though they didn't exist in the slightest, one after another. They landed on the marbled floors, kicking up their surfboards and following behind Lionel as he walked forward, despite having never been here before. It felt as though Lionel knew it like the back of his hand. Gliding forward toward the grand hall without a single pause in his steps, bang! A sparkling black pillar appeared in Raja's hand, which he used to ram against the enormous double doors, slamming against it so hard that they flew off of their hinges, slamming into the sides of the hall with a bang so loud that it echoed through the entire temple. Raj hoisted his large pillar over his shoulder and led the charge into the grand hall. At that moment, there were tens of thousands of clergymen kneeling on prayer mats, bowing in worship to the stature of a several kilometers tall of a person Lionel could only conclude had to be Zoltine. Zoltine's glass orbs looked a lot more like a radiant halo that, instead of being parallel to the ground, was actually perpendicular with it. Hovering behind his head, he had hands but on a single pair of arms, the other two pairs hovering in the air in mock prayer along with his only seemingly real pair of hands, at his forehead. There was a glass orb embedded that seemed to reflect the world of his ethereal glabella. Within it, a world of rainbow glass could be seen, exuding an air of peace and majesty, despite his usual thoughts on such matters. Lionel had to admit that this Zoltine at least looked like a god. But those extra hands, P Alpha D Alpha, no one. Lionel had read about such a race. They also had glass orbs in their forehead and extra hands that seemed completely separate from their bodies. They were known as a nomad race. Lionel's gaze narrowed. Even the Void Palace didn't have in-depth information on faiths and their gods. But these gods had to come from somewhere. So there were a number of working hypotheses. Some assumed that these were heroes of the past, much like echoes through history making their mark on today. Some assumed that it was the direct opposite, and they were instead powerhouses of the past influencing the past and leaving their mark. And for some others, they assumed that they were present heroes spreading word of their prowess. These faiths were likely related to the God path in some way or another, or at the very least, some divergent path of it. The reason the God path was denoted as such was precisely because of the influence it could have on its environment when taken to an extreme. And these seemed to be related to what these religions could accomplish. At that moment, a clergyman stood from beneath the statue of Zoltine, and then another, and then another. They all had robes rippling with rainbow colors and glass orbs hovering above and behind their heads that were a size larger than everyone else. Their gazes locked onto Lionel and the others, their expressions flooded with fury. Lionel walked forward slowly, his gaze locked onto clergyman. Who are you? The clergyman who spoke was the current head of the Zoltine faith within Earth's territory, a tall man who went by Impreza. This didn't seem to be a name, but more so a title, likely one unique to their faith. Do you not recognize the prince of the territory you're terrorizing? Lionel asked coolly. They'll give you two choices, Impreza. Take your faith, your clergyman, and what offerings you've managed to scrounge up and scram out of my territory, or, we can start a massacre. Which will it be? The Impreza's expression turned malevolent. However, when it settled in that Lionel was a prince of the Ascension Empire, he didn't seem to want to lash out immediately, as though he was still looking for a method out of this. Is this appropriate? You still haven't stated what we've done wrong? Does the prince of the empire not welcome religions? Aren't you afraid that the hearts of the people will grow cold? So you're aware that this is an empire too, right? Not a democracy. Do I need to explain to you why I do the things I do? The recently calmed expression of the Impreza turned ugly. It was clear that Lionel had no intention of negotiating with them. They hadn't expected to run into someone like this. While it was true that an empire wasn't a democracy, they still had to keep the people and their thoughts in mind. An empire that did and acted as they pleased wouldn't last very long. If you didn't care for the thoughts of the people, you would be overthrown. This should have been an opportunity to expand recklessly. With Earth surrounded by problems from all sides, there was no way they should be able to react like this without worrying about the consequences. The Impreza suddenly calmed, staring toward Lionel deeply. Fine, we will retreat. The glorious Zoltine cannot withstand the loss of even one son or daughter. You will face retribution for your actions today. The impersa pressed his hands together. Lionel smiled, however deep within, he knew what the true intentions of the impersa was. They would retreat for now and wait for an opportunity to come back when the Ascension Empire would have no choice but to accept them. Indeed, this impersa was quite intelligent. But so was Lionel. Chapter 1775. Published at 14th of April 2023 11:29 and 36 seconds AM. Chapter 1775. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1775. Power of Information. Esteemed impersa. Is this really okay? Not long after Lionel and the others had left, the clergyman of the Zoltene faith couldn't help but say something. While the lower-ranking members didn't dare to speak, those who had been beneath Zoltene's statue alongside the impersa couldn't hold it in any longer. We must have patience, the impersa said lightly, his hands still pressed together. The faith of his gloriousness will be spread regardless of its obstacles. We will make a comeback in due time, but for now, it is best to take a step back. We can only say that we were unlucky. But this tribulation will be weathered by us. When we come out the other side, we will be stronger than ever. Although the impersa didn't say it in so many, those that were intelligent understood. Soon, the Ascension Empire would be experiencing more pressure than they knew how to handle. When that time came and they chose to come back, they wouldn't even have the time to deal with them. After they reaffirmed their position in Earth's territory, there would be nothing the Ascension Empire could do. The seeds had already been sown. Impersa. Impersa. It had only been several minutes. But an attendant had already run into the prayer hall. Rushing forward with information, one must maintain a calm mind beneath the presence of his gloriousness. Mind yourself. The impersa said lightly. Yes, yes. The young clergyman took deep breaths, but eventually wasn't patient enough to wait until they had calmed down completely. Shrine, the shrines, the branch shrines, destroyed, the impersa's pupils constricted. How many? Before the impersa could finish his question, another attendant rushed in with the same news. Then another, the impersa's fists clenched beneath his robes. Many of those shrines were exceptionally well hidden. He had expected to lose some in the worst-case scenario. But by the time the fifth attendant rushed in, he realized that they had all been destroyed with a speed that didn't even feel like it made sense. It was as though Lionel could cover the whole Ascension Empire with a single hand, with their shrines destroyed. Even if they came back, it would take decades to build their network back up again. If that was the case, their comeback would be almost meaningless. They would have little to no momentum. And by the time they gathered some up again, whatever troubles the Ascension Empire might be facing just might be over. And in the worst case, even if the Ascension Empire fell, Earth's territory would be gobbled up by others and have nothing to do with them. At that point, even the impersa couldn't quite keep his calm. Years ago, the Evergreen Faith lost their main shrine under mysterious circumstances. Due to this, the Zoltene Faith was able to overtake them in a lot of ways. But now, the situation had been reversed once again and the Evergreen Faith once more had a chance at claiming a monopoly on Earth's territory. Just as the impersa was about to lose his cool entirely, the planet-sized temples suddenly trembled. Many were immediately thrown off their feet. The sound of battle reached their ears, and the impersa's ugly expression finally set in. No matter how cool-headed he normally was, it was impossible for him to maintain it. His immediate assumption was that Lionel had made them begin a retreat sequence so that they couldn't react to the destruction of their shrines. Then he doubled back to finish off the job for good. This was a devious plot, one that was impossible to execute unless one had the ability to travel across Earth's territory in just a handful of seconds. Unless Lionel had already set up a team at each location. But if he had done that, then what would have been the point of allowing them to begin their escape sequence? The impersa couldn't quite understand what was happening until there was suddenly a burst at the doors of the prayer hall once again, doors that had only just been fixed. But to the impersa's shock, rather than it being Lionel's team, it was a group he had never expected to see at all. They all wore brown robes and had golden lotuses etched onto the backs formed out of human hands. These weren't Lionel's men, nor were they people of Earth. This was the Evergreen religion. The head clergyman of the Evergreen led the charge, her strides long and her brownish gold hair fluttering beneath her speed. Priestess Irotha, what is the meaning of this? The Imperza's voice boomed. Priestess Irotha's expression didn't change, her gorgeous features radiating with a holy light. However, deep within her brown eyes there was a hint of disgust and disdain that came from the depths of her soul. 30 years ago, when you all destroyed the main shrine of our evergreen faith, did you think that such a day would come? This is nothing more than the cycle of karma, Priestess Irotha said lightly. The faith of Evergreen may not be the most powerful, but we are the most resilient. So long as there is but a single bud remaining within a ravaged land, we will grow once more. Her everlasting is immortal, and so shall we be. The Imperza's expression changed once again. Destroyed their main shrine? They had never done such a thing. Slander. The Imperza's fury threatened to bubble over, but he could already feel his power slipping away. With the destruction of so many shrines, how could he match up to Priestess Irotha? Irotha sneered, clearly not believing the Imperza. She waved her hand. Erase them. You're evil, Cap. I like it. Raj rolled in laughter, slapping Lionel's shoulder a few times. Lionel smiled. We have Raylion and the others to thank. These things are almost too easy to handle so long as we have enough information in our hands. Let's go and see what the Viola family is up to. In this regard, the Imperza was quite pitiful. It wasn't the Zoltine faith that had destroyed the main shrine of the Evergreen faith, but rather the Three-Finger cult. But it was all too easy to frame them when it was the Zoltine faith that had gained the most from their fall. Of course, this would put the Evergreen faith in line to become a problem of its own, but Lionel would focus on one problem at a time. At the very least, after being destroyed once, the Evergreen faith was far more reserved and cautious. Now, Lionel was entirely focused on the return of the Viola family. Years ago, Lionel's mother had told him that Richard had something in his possession that he would be very interested in, but so many things had happened that Lionel never got the chance to inquire about what exactly that meant. Now, it seems that his neglect had allowed a rebirth of a family that had already been dealt with. Of all the problems he had caused, this was probably the one that was the most directly his fault. But that was fine, he had destroyed them once, and he would do it again. Lionel alone was dangerous enough. Lionel with a vast net of information might not even need to raise a finger to destroy someone. Chapter 1776. Published at 14th of April 2023 11:29 and 37 seconds AM. Chapter 1776. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1776 treated you well. Lionel and the others stood above a familiar location. The last time they had been here, they had come for the opportunity to enter the Void Palace. Back then, only a few of them had been able to enter, the rest of them being turned away. It could be said that this place was one of the turning points of Lionel's life. This place was none other than the three central planets of the Three Pillars sector, a location that had once been overtaken by the Luxnix family, stripping away control from the Viola family and Montex family. But now, this was a region solely under the control of the Viola family, as the Luxnix family, or what remained of them, had moved to be closer to the core regions of Earth's territory, regions where the resources were far more abundant. Ironically, this had allowed the Viola family to finally gain exactly what it had been that they were looking for throughout the effort of several generations. Technically, there was no reason for Lionel to have any hatred for the Viola family. In reality, they had never really done anything to him, and though Richard had tried to make Aina his wife, back then he and Aina weren't together. As things went, the Viola family was just unlucky. They had gotten the Luxnix who were on the upswing, resulting in them losing generations of hard work before they could get their own chance to rise up. But it seemed, now that they were able to even cause trouble, they had recovered quite well. Lionel had many thoughts about how this would be possible. A portion was the treasure his mother had tipped him off about back then, but he also had other thoughts swirling in his mind as well. At that moment, a ship suddenly broke through the atmosphere of planet Viola. Much like the past, the airspace of the three planets was quite crowded with a ton of traffic coming in and out. Due to this, the appearance of Lionel and the others was quite inconspicuous despite the fact they stood on surfboards. Even so, this spaceship didn't hesitate to make a straight line toward them, causing Lionel's gaze to narrow. And then, a voice projected out toward them. It is our honor to welcome your highness. If you could please follow me, I will bring you to Patriarch Viola. He is very eager to see you. Lionel didn't say anything for a long while. He had just come, but apparently his presence had already been seen through. Well, this wasn't necessarily impossible. It had already been several days since he dealt with the four families and long enough since he removed the Zoltine faith from existence. It wasn't impossible for this news to have made it to the Viola family. They knew best what they had been doing, and it was likely that they were likewise prepared to take the approach the Zoltine faith had. Toward this, Lionel could only inwardly chuckle. It seemed that everyone seemed to think that he was a pushover. His grandpa was really too casual with this sort of stuff, but that only made Lionel more curious about what the old man was hiding. Lionel didn't get the vibe that his grandfather was a passive man, nor was he the kind of man to be indecisive in action. If he was, he wouldn't have allowed over 99% of Earth's population to be wiped out just to save them the trouble of dealing with invalids. Thinking back, if Earth had formed billions of invalids, something that was likely to happen considering the huge hurdle their talents had to face, especially in comparison to other worlds, the sheer number of variant invalids that would have been formed by now would have overrun the human domain. Although he didn't like the decision his grandfather had made back then, the current Lionel was more than capable of seeing the logic. Lionel faintly nodded eventually, sorting his thoughts. Gaining acknowledgement they were looking for, the attendant manning the spaceship breathed out in relief and turned the ship around to guide them back toward planet Viola. The planet swirled with the very same violet and white colors it had the last time Lionel saw it, but the expanse of the Viola family estate was easily double the size it had been before, taking up the entirety of the planet. It could be seen at a glance that while there was a ton of traffic above the three planets, very few if any came toward this direction. It wasn't long before Lionel and the others were standing in a grand throne room, the gazes several individuals looking down toward them from all sides. This space was no less grand than the imperial court of the Ascension Empire, making Lionel somewhat amused. While the gazes they were receiving couldn't be considered outright hostile, they lacked any sort of respect one would expect from greeting a prince and empire you were supposedly subservient to. Another thing that Lionel noticed was that the ages of the individuals in this courtroom were particularly young, some were even younger than Lionel himself. While there were older individuals, they were most definitely in the minority, but in comparison to the youth, the gaze of these older individuals was even closer to hostile than the youth's. At that moment, a set of doors behind the throne opened up and a young man wearing glistening violet and gold robes stepped out, his long black hair tied into a noble bun and violet eyes seemingly piercing through the veil. Lionel recognized this young man all too well. He was none other than Richard Viola. However, his bearing was even sharper than it had been in the past, and the maturity between his brows was far more prominent. What was maybe the most shocking was that he seemed to be a middle-aged man, something that was impossible even if he didn't improve even a single step since Lionel last saw him. 20 years wasn't enough for a fifth-dimensional expert to exhibit such signs of age. Lionel's lip curled and he spoke even before Richard got a chance to sit on his throne. It seems your world spirit has treated you well. Chapter 1777. Published at 14th of April 2023 11:29 and 37 seconds AM. Chapter 1777. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1777. Kill them all. Richard only paused for a moment before he continued to sit down, turning his attention toward Lionel. From his vantage point, he looked down at the group without the slightest hint of discomfort on his face. The last time Lionel had seen Richard, he was already well into his 70s, but he still looked like a young man. Of course, the current Richard didn't look old, he looked to be in his late 20s to early 30s, still shy of middle-aged, but given his previous dimension, it should have taken at least another several decades before he reached this point. Lionel found this change to be very interesting. Why have you come to my Viola family today? Richard asked faintly. I think you know quite well. Lionel replied. If I was aware, I would not play games with esteemed imperial prince. We are within your territory, after all. Oh. In that case I came to kill you for those rumors you spread about my mother. The moment Lionel's words echoed, the several ministers in the court all stood at once, their auras flaring. Despite the youth of the vast majority of them, even the weakest had powerful auras within the sixth dimension. In fact, the pressure they exuded wasn't small, and there were even a number of them already in the seventh dimension. Lionel's gaze flashed when he sensed this. Indeed, the Viola family of today wasn't the Viola family of the past. This had to be as a result of the Viola family's world spirit. Originally, the world spirit for this region had been separated into three pieces, one for the Viola family, one for the Luxnix family, and the last for the Montex. The Luxnix family should have taken the destruction of the Viola family to snatch their piece for themselves, but it seemed that this hadn't happened. From what Lionel had learned, those who had world spirits gained quite the advantage within the zone, allowing them to display their strength while others didn't gain this luxury. Whatever it was that Richard had experienced, it was enough for him to turn his situation around. Despite Lionel's blatant threat, Richard raised a hand and forced his ministers to sit. It was clear that compared to Lionel, the place Richard had in the hearts of these individuals was far higher. Earth's influence was already waning here, and yet it was their sector. It could be said that just from this display, Earth had quite a number of issues to deal with. If they didn't even have strong control over their own sector, then there was simply no chance for everything else. You must be joking, Imperial Prince. I thought that this matter was handled long ago. Was it not the Imperial Princess herself who pardoned me? Richard replied indifferently. Pardoned? It was more so that she allowed you to live due to what usefulness you could have to me, but I haven't seen your use yet. In fact, if not for me, would you even be here to sit on your lofty throne? At that moment, Lionel's smiling expression suddenly vanished and the ground beneath him trembled. You take yourself too seriously, don't you think? Lionel's voice boomed, the ground suddenly quaking and shattering. The stairs that elevated Richard's throne suddenly crumbled, compressing into the ground. In the blink of an eye, Richard had gone from sitting on a lofty throne to being seated within a pit that left him a full head shorter than Lionel. At this point, it was he who had no choice but to look up. No one could even react to the change at all, but by the time the rumbling completed and the force dispersed, the deed was done. Richard sat in the pit with a narrowed gaze. Lionel's explosiveness had caught even him off guard. It was only now he realized just how unpredictable Lionel could be. He was entirely unreadable. Originally, he thought like the Impreza of the Zoltene faith. His assumption was that Lionel had things to worry about and couldn't be too out of hand with his reaction. But now, he suddenly wasn't so sure anymore. Before Richard held any power in his hand, he had always been cunning and scheming. His intelligence was exceptional. If not for this, he wouldn't have been able to cause the resurrection of the Viola family so quickly. But there were some things that intelligence couldn't overcome. This was something he had learned the hard way the first time, and he wouldn't make the same mistake again. Richard slowly rose to his feet, stepping out of the pit. He had always been shorter than Lionel, so even now, he was still about a head shorter. But even so, he felt far better and more unrestrained on his feet. If Imperial Prince believes that I am the same man I was in the past, you would be sorely mistaken. My Viola family is guilty of nothing other than fighting for territory. The only difference is that we are better than others. In the past, my Viola family was destroyed. This was because we were inferior to others. I have no complaints. But now that we have risen from the ashes, soaring into the skies like true phoenixes, we won't allow others to press us down once again. Our dignity will not be trampled upon. Richard's voice boomed and the blood of the Viola family members boiled. They stood to their feet once again, but this time, Richard didn't ask them to sit. It was clear that they were prepared to fight any moment now. If Lionel truly didn't back down, they would even dare to kill an imperial prince of the empire. Lionel's serious expression suddenly gave way to a laugh. I left for a couple decades and I returned to find that everyone has gotten so much more arrogant. Even enemies I've already trampled once before are scurrying up again. What do your words count for? This isn't Viola territory, this is the Ascension Empire. Fight for territory? What right do you have to do that? Even if I told you to give up this planet right now, you would have to obediently do so. Lionel's pupils suddenly constricted. Before he could react, Richard's fist had already appeared before his eyes. It was simply too late to react. Bang! Lionel's head exploded into a rain of blood, bone, and gore, his final words still echoing. "Kill them all," Richard said indifferently. Chapter 1778. Published at 14th of April 2023 11:29 and 37 seconds AM. Chapter 1778. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. Chapter 1778. Chest deep within space, the flagship hung in silence. Lionel watched the scene of his death with a cold expression. Indeed, Richard dared to attack, and indeed, his strength wasn't a joke. Lionel had sent his clones constructed of emulation spatial force in his stead, feeling that something like this would happen. In fact, he felt that this would have likely happened even if he had been more lenient with his words and actions. It was clear that Richard was already prepared for the worst-case scenario and his level of alertness was high. In the final moments before his clone's death, the spatial force activated and replaced it with a real corpse. With the depth of his dream force, it was almost impossible to see through the differences, especially if Richard was going to shatter his skull like that. As for Lionel's brothers, Richard was even less familiar with them. That said, Lionel didn't particularly care if Richard saw through the ruse since things were already past this point. The results would be the same so long as he dared to attack. But now, Lionel had to choose his next step carefully, and the best course of action would depend on what Richard's choice was. As Lionel saw it, there were two possibilities. Either Richard was confident enough to double down and remain in Earth's territory, or he already had an exit plan. This little bitch, Raja's expression twisted with rage. He was only just sane enough to not go running down there for revenge. Watching himself die, even if it was just a clone, triggered memories he didn't like to remember. The same went for most of them. Though they didn't express it like Raj had, they stared daggers at the floating monitor, wanting for murder. If not for Lionel's orders, they might have already gone all out to attack. "We can't take him casually," Lionel suddenly said. "He's in the 7th dimension, and he's most definitely not weak among them. If I'm correct, he would probably rank favorably against the domain-ranked disciples of the Void Palace." Raj grit his teeth. How'd he become so powerful? "My best guess is that he gained greatly from the zone, and it might also be related to that secret of the Viola family my mother mentioned. Unfortunately, there were too many things that happened one after another after we went to the Void Palace and I never had the time to investigate it." Lionel wasn't wrong. By the time they got there, the trial began immediately. Richard obviously hadn't had the skill to make it far in the trial back then, so he ended up in the ranks of nominal disciples while Lionel had become a quasi-galaxy-ranked disciple for a while. Then he lost the segmented cube and was basically kidnapped by his uncle, so there really was no time to worry about the likes of Richard. "What's the plan, Cap?" Milan asked. "We'll have to wait to see how Hell react. The problem with the thrusting skies sector might have to wait. I have a feeling that Richard is a much bigger threat." So, the group waited. But after several moments, Lionel's eyes couldn't help but narrow. The monitoring system of the flagship was excellent. When it was configured correctly, picking up sound and images across even light years was very much possible. However, depending on the defenses of your target, these images could be better or worse. Even after configuring, Lionel could only pick up images and not sound from planet Viola, proving that their defenses were actually quite excellent considering how close to the planet the flagship was. However, this didn't matter much. With his abilities, reading lips was all too easy, the sounds might as well have been blaring in his ears. But to Lionel's shock, Richard really had no intention of leaving. In fact, he was delegating normal tasks and sending his ministers off to maintain order. There was nothing out of the ordinary, as though he hadn't just killed an imperial prince at all. Lionel leaned back in his chair and chuckled when Richard even tasked someone with fixing up the throne room. Soon, they dispersed and Lionel's configuration was no longer useful. It would take several hours more of effort to configure it to a new location, so there was nothing left to observe. This was the only real drawback of the monitoring system. Unless he had an exact location like a throne room that would obviously be used to welcome guests, it was quite useless. Lionel fell into his own thoughts. Although he had listed this as an option, he hadn't actually expected it to happen. Lionel now had enough justification to turn his cannons toward Planet Viola and eradicate them. But he did have his reservations about it. The Zoltene faith wasn't taken out by him, so it wouldn't be a sin for him to bear. But this would be different, especially since he had just finished destroying those 4 families. Whether it was the Impreza or Richard, they were both right that Lionel would have reservations. It was just that Lionel was good at finding ways to circumvent this. The unfortunate part was that while he could see the depths of the Zoltene faith easily, he couldn't seem to do the same with Richard. This made things far more complicated. Lionel's finger tapped his armrest. In just a few seconds, he had already gone through several possibilities. Interesting. In that case, we'll have to suffocate them in other ways. It's fine if other sectors are in turmoil, but this sector, Earth sector, has to be entirely problem-free. Chaotic water sector. Thrust skies sector. 3-pillar sector. Lionel's gaze began to glow, information flying by one after another. Lionel suddenly stood, a plan formulating in his mind. Battling personally really would be too troublesome, and that of course considered the fact he wasn't certain if defeating Richard in his current state was even possible. In that case, he would just have to play some chess. Chapter 1779. Published at 19th of April 2023 10:46 and 27 seconds AM. Chapter 1779. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1779 in the clear. You're okay? Lionel smiled, looking forward with a hint of gentleness in his eyes. Even in comparison to the usual, his gaze for Aina was even more caring. But it was difficult to tell if this was because they had finally taken that step in their relationship, or if it was because the loss of his brothers, albeit temporary, had made his grip on what was important to him all the firmer. Aina, who had just finished recovering from her fatigue and had come out to see what Lionel was up to, was dazed for a moment. She had come out with the intent that she would either find battle or Lionel hard at work, so her mentality was there. But she hadn't expected to see such a pair of eyes the moment she stepped out. The huge pendulum swing between expectation and reality left her frozen, and not long afterward left her blushing to say. She was almost immediately embarrassed by her own reaction. Lionel hadn't really said anything be considered normal, but she couldn't help it. That feedback loop only made her blush harder. Just when Aina was feeling her most embarrassed, the sound of hooting, hollering, and whistling came from behind Lionel. She only realized then that the 2 of them weren't alone and there were actually 8 more people watching with rapt attention. In fact, Raj had even managed to find himself a bucket of popcorn as he eked so far out to the side that he was nearly falling from chair. Ah. You. She suddenly wanted to lash out at Lionel. Couldn't he have warned her or something? The last time she had seen Lionel's brothers, they weren't exactly on the best of terms. And now she had suddenly appeared again only to be embarrassed like this. Aina leaned forward and pressed her forehead into Lionel's chest, seemingly trying to hide. Her embarrassment had suddenly gained a hint of anxiousness. To make matters worse, she felt like she was walking around with, "I just had sex," on her forehead. Seeing Aina suddenly become so flustered, Lionel couldn't help but burst into laughter. There were 2 sides to this girlfriend of his. There was the bold Aina and then there was this version. When he first met her, it was hard to tell which version he would get. But now it just felt amusing to bring it out himself, and it felt even better when she accidentally stumbled into it herself like now. Hearing Lionel's laughter, Aina missed Yuri and Savon. She had already been thinking about trying to find them again, but now she definitely needed backup or else these hooligans would hound her to death. Yeah, I'm going to head to the Umbra family to see how they're doing for now. You all focus on the smaller tasks around the Earth's territory, make it known that we aren't letting certain things slide anymore, build up a mystique. Forget the older issues. The instant you get a new report, go there. I want to give off the feeling that we can appear anywhere instantly. I want people to hesitate before they even commit a crime. Here. Lionel flipped a palm and several masks appeared. However, these weren't normal masks at all. They fit over their heads, front, back and sides, and obscured everything. They seemed to be made out of a mesh material and they had a fluorescent pair of eyes that appeared outside, hovering within the black mesh material. The result made it look as though they were nothing but eyes. They had no mouths, no ears, nothing but a piercingly sharp gaze reminiscent of a wild beast. These masks, or helmets if that's more accurate, will send you all information filtered through me first. It'll assign a difficulty rating and an optimal approach to the situation. Depending, only one of you might need to act, or it could be three or you, or even all of you. So long as you follow the plan, everything should be fine. Within a single month, the word should spread adequately. Leave the Thrusting Skies sector and the Viola family to me. I made a mistake letting that Richard live once, he won't get the opportunity again. Gotcha, Cap. Drake, Alan, Arnold and Joel seemed to be the only ones paying attention. As for the other four, they were still enraptured by the mesh masks. Only after they realized Lionel was finished speaking did they wave a hand toward him as though they got it. Lionel chuckled but didn't mind too much. Then, he turned toward Aina. Are you going to follow me, or? I want to find Savon and Yuri, she replied. Lionel laughed. Are you that scared of being bullied? Aina glared at Lionel, but before she could respond, Joel suddenly spoke. Yuri and Savon probably aren't within Earth's territory right now. It was a bit hard for us to see eye to eye after the war because they felt that it was smarter to return to the Void Palace, but we wanted to stay on Earth in case anything else happened. Lionel raised an eyebrow. Though Joel explained it quite simply, Lionel had a feeling that their disagreement was probably a bit more explosive than that. It was difficult to manage their relationship without the existence of Lionel and Aina, especially since to them, that relationship had long since been strained. It wasn't until today that Lionel's brothers learned that he and Aina were actually back together again. So, given the fact they were on two opposite sides of the spectrum in this regard, it wasn't surprising that they found it difficult to reconcile. But to Lionel's shock, the one with the weirdest expression when the two were mentioned was actually Raj. Lionel's gaze landed on Raj as though he was trying to see through him. And Raj, almost immediately, felt as though he was in some sort of hot seat. Hey. You can't blame me, Cap. You're back together with Aina now, I'm in the clear. Chapter 1780. Published at 19th of April 2023 10:46 and 27 seconds AM. Chapter 1780. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1780. Nothing. Lionel was speechless for a long while, his mouth hanging open. No way. He eventually managed to say. Many words. What happened? How high was Lionel's EQ? How sharp were his senses? He could even see a reflection of Raj's soul if he so wanted to, and he could tell just from that inkling that Raj wasn't messing with him. It wasn't just Lionel who was looking at Raj with weird expressions. Clearly, this wasn't exactly public knowledge. The only one who didn't seem surprised was Joel, who was obviously aware of something previously, but this made sense. With Lionel not there, Joel was the de facto leader. In that sort of role, he would have to be aware of everything going on around him. Raj cleared his throat. Why are you all looking at me like that? Spill it, fatty, Milan glared from over the table. Raj sneered. Just because you're a 40-year-old virgin doesn't mean you can just lash out at me as you please. Some of us have sex lives. Milan's mouth hung open. Virgin? He wasn't a virgin. Raj had been the last virgin among them. Well, that didn't include Lionel, of course. But given Lionel's status in their hearts, none of them even really considered him to be a virgin. It is pretty clear to them that he could have lost it whenever he wanted to. In fact, even now, they weren't questioning his virginity, they just had their assumptions based on a few context clues. Lionel wasn't the type of person to go around talking about such a thing. The true virgin among them was Raj. This wasn't even necessarily because he couldn't find a girlfriend, but rather because he had a big mouth and a fiery temper. He had no idea how to filter his words or coax a woman. He just blurted out whatever he was thinking, and that wasn't exactly conducive to keeping a woman happy. Every time Raj got into a relationship, it ended in a fiery burning inferno, usually with him ranting at the top of his lungs about how idiotic the fairer sex was. It wasn't a coincidence that his words after Lionel and Aina's breakup were the most scathing. But the idea that Raj had not only lost his virginity finally, but even to one of either Savon or Yuri, left them entirely without words. This was especially so because he had never filtered himself in front of them, even talking about his dream of having a harem. But then again, since they were willing to leave him for so long, maybe they had gotten sick of his rant. Seeing everyone's speechlessness, Raj slammed his meaty palms onto the table. He could handle much of their scrutiny, but the way Alan was pushing up his glasses and even Arnold of all people was looking toward him with such interest was getting on his last nerve. Even the only person who could make him admit to such a thing, Lionel, was looking toward him as though his head was screwed on backward. You bastards. Can't you see this handsome specimen before you? Do I look like someone who struggles with women? Raj's voice boomed, causing a section of the flagship to quake. However, his reaction wasn't met with the reception he wanted and he almost deflated. Fuck. People can't recognize a good thing even when it's right in front of them. Alright, tell us what happened already. Stop throwing a temper tantrum, you big lug, Franco laughed, his gaze particularly lustful. Just tell us, who was it? Was it Savon or was it Yuri? Also, I need to tie dash. Franco found his voice caught in his throat. He coughed lightly as his head slowly turned toward Aina. She seemed to just be smiling a beautiful smile, but why was it that the air was suddenly so chilly? Ahem, Franco cleared his throat again. Less details, just tell us about your beautiful romance. Forget you all, Raj snorted. It was definitely Yuri, Lionel suddenly said, causing everyone to look toward him. I just didn't expect it. I underestimated you, big guy. Aina's own expression flickered with surprise as well, but since Lionel dared to say it, she believed him. He wouldn't be one to mess around like that. She suddenly wanted to see Yuri a lot more so that they could talk about this. She wanted details of her own, despite the fact she had given Franco such a friendly reminder. Interestingly enough, Raj deflated when Lionel finally said it, sinking into his chair with a sigh. He seemed to be regretting something, but it was already too late. It ended poorly, I take it? Milan asked. Bah, forget her, Raj waved a hand, his expression quite unhappy. But considering Raj of all people barely said anything and didn't even seem to be about to go on a rant, it seemed that this one was quite a deep one. But he eventually sat up. He had regrets when he died, maybe there was a chance now that he was living again. Ah, forget it, Raj waved a hand in distaste, I'm not chasing after that woman, she can kiss my ass. What happened, exactly? Milan pressed. Don't speak in code, or I'll beat it out of you. Raj glared toward Milan. It just didn't end well, alright? It couldn't have been that bad, you're not even ranting about it and we had to squeeze this information out of you. I bet it was nothing, Milan replied. Nothing? Raj sneered. The last word she said to me when she left was that she'd destroy her body and make herself a new one so that I couldn't say I took her first time. Is that still nothing? Milan's lip twitched. That was indeed a bit extreme. Lionel, though, had a different reaction to all of this. So that's it. Yuri really is a spiritual. Chapter 1781. Published at 19th of April 2023 10:46 and 27 seconds AM. Chapter 1781. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1781 in control. Lionel and Aina looked toward another and Lionel eventually coughed. He walked over and patted Raj on the shoulder. Hey, at least she said something. It could be worse, she could have just disappeared without saying anything at all. The moment Lionel said the words, he felt a hot gaze on the side of his face. However, he gathered up all the willpower in the world and raised a thumbs up. One could never say that he wouldn't take one for his brothers. As expected, the moment Raj heard this, he burst into a fit of laughter. Now, if you'll excuse me, Lionel said before vanishing in a beam of light. Wait right there. Aina called out from behind. Don't say I never did anything for you, Raj. Lionel's voice echoed beneath the laughter of his brothers. The Umbra family was quite an anomaly. Years ago, they had burst onto the scene, attacking Earth with a sweeping momentum, before they were suddenly repelled. Back then, many had made the assumption that they wouldn't give up like this. After all, Earth had only been at the 5th dimension during their first attack, making it difficult for them to send their true firepower over. They could only rely on their young geniuses and older individuals who had no chance of breaking into the 6th dimension. Such a lineup wasn't very conducive to success. Due to the circumstances, they had only been able to send a single 6th-dimensional existence in, their patriarch Xylem Umbra. But after his return, he made no movements to attempt a second attack, even after Earth became a 6th-dimensional existence and swallowed up their territory. This was odd to many observing the situation. Although the Umbra family wasn't exactly supremely powerful, they weren't weak either. Back then, beneath the Luxnix, Montex and Viola families, they were probably near first place. In addition, having your territory swallowed by the influence of another world spirit was nothing but bad. This was actually why Richard was fighting so hard to maintain control over a certain radius. When one world spirit overwhelms another, it's only a matter of time before the weaker world spirit loses all power. Once that happens, the generations birthed by the weaker world spirit will cease to exist and the newborns will begin the cycle of becoming Earthlings. If this continued, in 5 generations, everything your ancestors had built up would vanish and your people would become the people of the stronger world spirit. This wasn't necessarily a bad thing if your lineage was weak. After all, wouldn't you prefer to be a talent of Earth than a middling talent of a 6th-dimensional world? But everyone had their own ambitions, and that was especially since there was another option, and that was to swallow up the stronger world spirit yourself. If a weaker world overwhelmed an evolving world, it was possible to snatch the talent away and take it for yourself. In this way, not only would you be able to keep your lineage, you would also give it a great boost in strength. And yet, when Earth underwent a point of great vulnerability during its expansion into the 6th dimension, and was even compromised in a war against 4 now eradicated families, the Umbra family, which had been in the best position to strike, controlling a galaxy right outside of the Milky Way, actually did nothing. No, it wasn't accurate to say that they did nothing, and was far more accurate to say that they did nothing to Earth, because it was thanks to the Umbra family that many who wanted to take advantage of the situation found themselves absolutely stonewalled. The Umbra family, which was always known as one of decent strength, displayed a great amount of strength that felt well beyond its own and even played a key role alongside other mysterious figures in stopping others from taking advantage of Earth's greatest period of weakness. What others didn't know was that this was all because of a single young man, a young man who stood high in the skies and he looked down toward the shadowy planet. "You're finally here." The voice appeared in a wisp of smoke as a figure suddenly manifested by Lionel's side. This was none other than Radlease, a young man that Lionel had known since his days at Valiant Heart Mountain. It could be said that they were good friends for a while, though their relationship had ended up being a bit strained when Lionel learned that he was from the Umbra family and had only come to the Milky Way to prepare for an attack on Earth and, of course, target the Silver Tablet. Lionel smiled, seemingly not surprised by Radley's sudden appearance at all. "Sorry it took so long, apparently I was stuck in a zone for over 20 years. Radley's expression flickered. He had heard about the zone as well. In fact, he knew a bit more about it than most considering his Umbra family's former connections with the Three-Finger Cult. He was shocked that Lionel had made it out at all. "Oh. So you do know a little something about that zone." I was dash. "You might be disappointed with how much we know, but I guess you can say that we're aware of a small bit. You can follow me, everyone has been waiting for a while." In truth, after knowing that Lionel would enter the Void Palace, they had already been ready to wait more than just a few decades. After all, one wasn't supposed to be able to leave the Void Palace casually after entering it. The trade-off in time should have been worth it, but it was just unfortunate that Lionel didn't gain the boost in strength they were expecting from him in this time period. As a result, though they had been willing to wait, the situation was a bit more strained now than it would have been otherwise. Even so, what could they do? Just the fact Lionel knew of their connection to the Three-Finger Cult meant that he had them by the balls. No matter how dissatisfied some of them might be, it was all useless. Lionel was in control. Let's go," Lionel nodded. Chapter 1782. Published at 19th of April 2023 10:46 and 27 seconds AM. Chapter 1782. If audio player doesn't work, Press stop then play button again. 1782 Simple words compared to the throne rooms and royal courts that Lionel had been in before. The gathering room of the Umbra family was very simple. Up ahead, their patriarch, a man quite familiar to Lionel, Xylem Umbra, sat. But unlike Lionel's run-in with the Viola family, Xylem didn't seem to be flaunting his authority. In fact, he was quite eye level with Lionel and greeted him with a nod. What was interesting to Lionel, though, was that Xylem was still in the 6th dimension and he didn't seem to have improved very much at all. But this shouldn't have been surprising considering the fact that Xylem should have already been near the peak of his potential when Lionel met him the first time. It wasn't as though everyone would have vast improvements during his absence. However, this was still a curious matter. It had to be remembered that Lionel had drawn the connection between the Umbra family and the Three-Finger Cult. Lionel had been able to draw the connection between the Shadow Tail lineage factor of the Umbra family and the higher-grade lineage factors of the Umbra family. Even so, it felt odd that a family that was able to escape the Three-Finger Cult would be so weak. It felt like it would make more sense that they were purposely putting up such a front to remain hidden, but Lionel actually felt that it was far more complicated than this. At the very least, if remaining covert was actually their main priority, they probably wouldn't have attacked Earth back then. Unless they attacked precisely so that they wouldn't stand out. If they hadn't tried to take advantage of such a good opportunity, it would have made them look more odd than not. But now they're probably being placed in a difficult situation because of me now that they chose to stand out and protect Earth back then. On top of that, in order for them to have succeeded back then, they definitely had to have more strength in reserve than what they're displaying here. Interesting. Lionel didn't seem very uncomfortable with the silence in the room. Despite the several gazes trained on him, and the depth of darkness in the surrounding space, he seemed to be very comfortable in his own skin, whereas others might have started squirming by now. Can you old fogies stop staring so much? You're making my skin crawl, Radlease mumbled. In the quiet of the room, his voice was all too conspicuous. It seemed that the years hadn't taken the jokester out of Radlease, but even so, that only earned him more glares. They were trying to be serious here, but here was this boy ruining everything. Radlease scratched the back of his head with an awkward laugh and grin. Sorry, I only like it when beautiful women stare at me. Oh. Am I not beautiful enough for you? At that moment, a middle-aged woman turned a sharp eye toward Radlease. She was actually his aunt, and though she looked a bit aged, she definitely still had the air of a mature and graceful woman to her. Even with the faint wrinkles on her face, most men would be forced to take a second or third look before her. This woman was known as Celtin, and it felt that the moment she spoke, the entire room seemed to shift toward her, even more so than Patriarch Xylem himself. Radlease coughed. How could that be true, Auntie? I dream about you every day. I've lost count of the number of times I have lamented the fact we are related. Why are the heavens so cruel to me? I'm forever destined to not be with the world's greatest beauty. Radlease spoke as though he was pouring his heart out, but his antics caused the room which had been stifled with pressure to burst, becoming filled instead with stifled laughter. Even Lionel's lip twitched. Now that he thought about it, the first time he met Radlease he was chasing skirts. It seemed that he wasn't willing to let even his own aunt go. Toward this, observers could only be speechless. Celtin rolled her eyes. Obviously, she was likewise used to her nephew's nonsense. Radlease was lucky that the situation wouldn't allow it, or else she would have given him a nice spanking. After a moment, Celtin turned her gaze toward Xylem for a second before looking toward Lionel. You are a very intelligent boy since you could expose us when even the Three-Finger Cult could not, so I'm sure you understand our qualms as well, right? We are running out of time and circumstances have, unfortunately, caused you to lose almost a quarter of a century. While we were, indeed, prepared to wait even twice as long as that, I'm sure you can understand the difference between then and now, right? It would not be smart on our part to continue investing in you the same way. However, there is also not much we can do if you choose to hold our past over our heads either, so we are at a bit of an impasse. Hearing these words, rather than being annoyed, Lionel was actually quite curious. Although the words seemed simple, they implied many things. The first was that the Umbra three-finger cult that was likely beyond just pure survival. The second was that they were prepared to execute this plan so long as Lionel would allow them an amicable separation. And the third was that they weren't willing to have a falling out with Lionel if they didn't have to. If they killed Lionel, it wouldn't be long before the spotlight was on them again, and that would make remaining hidden almost impossible. In addition, they would make themselves a great number of enemies, whether that was the Ascension Empire or the Morales family. They didn't believe that others wouldn't know that Lionel had come here today, so it was impossible for them to take this course of action casually. Chapter 1783. Published at 19th of April 2023, 10:46 and 28 seconds AM. Chapter 1783. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1783. Am not here. Lionel didn't speak immediately. In truth, he had come here for two reasons. The first was to touch base and make sure that everything was running smoothly, while the second was to give the Umbra family the bronze and silver tablets of the dark half of their lineage factor. From what Lionel could see, the Umbra family was stuck with their Shadowtail lineage factor much like the Luxnix family had been stuck with the Snowy Star Owl. But, compared to the original Luxnix family, the Umbra family had far more potential and talent. It was just hard for them to see the road forward. If they were able to upgrade their lineage factors, the help that they could provide to Lionel would be much better. The gap between the lineage factors was not small. If not for the perfect synergy between the two halves of the lineage factors, Lionel would have already abandoned his panda construct in favor of the stronger lineage factors of the Dark Force half. But now, Lionel realized that he would need to understand more about the Umbra family before he made this decision. In truth, the reason why he trusted them was obvious. This wasn't because he liked Radlease, or he understood Silem's character. It was rather because he had a firm hold of their greatest weakness. Someone who feared him and what he could do to them was much more trustworthy in almost all cases. Judging by the context clues of Seltin's words, however, there was too much he didn't understand to hold firmly to this conviction. In fact, just the mere fact Seltin was speaking instead of Silem spoke volumes about how little he knew. I can tell you now that you've got it wrong, Lionel spoke slowly. It isn't me who should be convincing you of my use to you, but rather the vice versa. Seltin and the others frowned at these words. For a moment, they thought that Lionel might not have been as intelligent as they once thought. Could he not tell the underlying meaning of their words? Did he really think that this was all they had? Lionel shook his head. The matter of the three-finger cult is trivial as of right now. Even if you all were suddenly exposed right this moment, I highly doubt that the cult would have the bandwidth to deal with you right now. In fact, I'm pretty sure they have their hands full dealing with my old man's temper. Lionel had already deduced that there was just one matter that could be keeping his father busy, and that had to be the three-finger cult. This was just an obvious conclusion to make. The Void Palace had been all but out of commission for at least 10 years before it finally clawed back enough high-ranking members to re-establish themselves. But even then, their rules became more difficult to implement, and even something as simple as their no-leaving policy was broken again and again, casually. Even setting aside Lionel's brothers, even the likes of Richard had just directly left without a word. It was clear that the prestige of the Void Palace had taken a great hit. And yet, even with the Void Palace absent, what was the worst thing that had happened in these last 20 years? The invasion of the Cloud Race, maybe? Compared to what could have, or one could even argue should have happened, that was a mere joke. The only way that the three-finger cult could have been stalled for that period of time was if someone, or several someones with exceptional power, had stifled them at every turn. If Lionel knew of the disparaging words the three-finger cult had spoken about his old man, he would have laughed directly in their faces. To him, such words would have sounded no different from the triggered ravings of a group of losers. And, now that the Void Palace was back, the task ahead for the three-finger cult would only be made more difficult. As expected, when Lionel said these words, Seltin's expression flickered. I don't need to threaten you, and I don't have a habit of threatening those who are supposed to be my allies. Is that why you destroyed those 4 families? Seltin asked lightly. Lionel grinned. Were they supposed to be my allies? As far as I know, in the midst of a crisis, instead of supporting the world they were born in, they attacked it and slaughtered countless young geniuses. Destroying them, as far as I'm concerned, was taking it easy on them. Celtin didn't respond. Her words seemed to be implying something different, but at this moment, it didn't seem to matter much. So, I'll say it again. It isn't you all who needs convincing. I came here today with the intention of helping your family a great deal, but now I'm not so sure anymore. Anyone could just say those words. An elder suddenly spoke from the side. Bang! A bronze tablet fell from Lionel's ring onto the ground, causing cracks to spread in all directions. Can they? Why am I not so certain of that? Lionel asked without even looking in the direction of the elder who spoke. By this point, although Lionel's gaze never left Celtin, even her own eyes were entirely focused on the bronze tablet at his feet. It radiated an aura that they were all too familiar with, an aura that made their hearts skip several beats. It very much at all, letting it rest at his feet without a single hint on his expression to its value. Even if you all are 1,000 times more powerful than what you've shown on the surface, I can promise that I can still leave this place entirely unscathed. So, I won't repeat myself again. This time, I'll need proper explanations. I'm not here to beg you, I'm here to lead you. I'm not here to threaten you, I'm here to show you a light at the end of the tunnel. If you don't want it, just say so and our relationship will be cut off here. Just don't think of coming back to me later. I already have a pet peeve against being tested. Chapter 1784. Published at 19th of April 2023 10:46 and 28 seconds AM. Chapter 1784. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1784. Beyond Celtin's gaze narrowed, but even after she looked back up to meet Lionel's, he didn't flinch a single time. In fact, it was she who felt her throat suddenly constrict as though just a thought of acting against Lionel would lead to her death. This was, of course, ridiculous, or at the very least, she thought that it should be. Even with the strength she only showed on the surface, it should be enough to deal with a Tier 1 Lionel. Let alone her true strength. So why did she feel so uncomfortable? What do you want to know? Celtin finally spoke. The obvious, Lionel replied without missing a beat. Why did you leave the three-finger cult? How did you leave them? Why are you all stuck at the shadow tail level of the lineage factors? What is the true depth of your strength? The obvious, Lionel repeated. Celtin's jaw set and she leaned back into her chair. Radlease, who was still standing by Lionel's side, coughed slightly, pulling at his color. Is it just me or is it a bit hot in here? This time, Radley's antics didn't get any laughs. In fact, the atmosphere only became heavier until Celtin finally spoke. Believe it or not, the three-finger cult wasn't always like this. The original intention of the three-finger cult was to save humanity. I'm sure that those who remain still believe that that's what they're doing, but as far as we are concerned, they've strayed from that path long ago. The moment they began to target fellow humans for the supposed greater good, they had already lost their way. Lionel's gaze narrowed, but he didn't interrupt. The three-finger cult gained its name from its three founders. Oddly enough, only two of them were human and the third was a demon. The other two founders, one is likely one you have never heard of, a man who called himself king, and the second was a true emperor, the first ruler of the Silver Empire, Emperor Silver I. One would think that it would be the demon who betrayed the other two, but the one who did was the second human, King. Without wasting time getting into the weeds, King turned the human race against the Silver Empire, leading to their destruction. It was said that the reason for this was a love triangle between the three, as it was probably more accurate to say that their third member wasn't a demon, but rather a demoness. The details of that period are murky to many, but in the annals of history, it had always been written that the Silver Empire betrayed the human race, turning into unrecognizable demons. One could only guess that the demoness of the three-finger cult chose Emperor Silver, and King was enraged by this. Lionel frowned. Something wasn't adding up. If the founders of the three-finger cult involved the founder of the Silver Empire, how is it that this grudge led to the destruction of the empire? It didn't make any sense. No matter what, the Silver Empire was a powerful dynasty and it had many emperors. By the time the Silver Empire fell, the founders of the three-finger cult should have long been dead. From what Lionel understood about lifespans, this shouldn't be possible. Even wise Star Order, who was supposedly immortal, had a cap to his lifespan. This is an answer I cannot give you. All I know is that these words are most definitely the truth, because even now, King is still alive. Lionel's pupils constricted, his heart palpitating. If Sultan wasn't lying, then this wasn't just a small matter. What level of strength did someone who had lived for so long have? How did this make any sense at all? Sultan took a breath and exhaled. It was obvious that this was also something she thought about a lot. Our Umbra family is made of individuals whose hearts turned cold due to this decision and the few members that remain of the Silver Empire. We hope to make it back one, but for now we live in the shadows. This is why we've taken on the name Umbra. Sultan shook her head. We cannot tell you the true depth of our power as it does matter regardless. We will never show the world more than this level of strength, and even if you give us the bronze tablet to meditate upon and regain our lineage factor, we will never show it to the outside world either, not until we are ready to strike back against the three-finger cult. Ultimately, the reason we only have the shadow tail lineage factor is because for us, it doesn't manifest like a lineage factor at all. Instead, it manifests like an ability index. It is not inherited, it's instead passed down to us. The original three-finger cult didn't have strong familial ties, so it was difficult to maintain the lineage factor across many generations, and even when it did appear, it was becoming so scarce that it was difficult to display good results. In addition, since the cult only had one tablet, it wasn't feasible to allow everyone a chance to meditate on it, especially as the organization expanded. So, as a result of this, the Demoness created this method of lineage factor transfer. Only by contributing to the cause could we then gain an opportunity to meditate on the tablet and thus progress. But, obviously, after our escape, we forever lost this chance and have been trying to find new methods of progression. I can only say that, this tablet is indeed very valuable to us. You are correct in your original assessment. As Sultan's words echoed, flashes of lightning were sparking through Lionel's dreamscape. He felt like he was making connections faster and faster between things that had previously seemed entirely disconnected, even some things related to his grandpa Morales. But before he could even focus on those things, Lionel's mind suddenly snapped toward the Demoness. A Demoness, capable of passing down lineage factors as though they were ability indexes. The silver tablet was also somewhat similar to this, was it not? Just who was this Demoness? And why was it that she was the only one Setlin left unnamed? For some reason, Lionel had a feeling that this Demoness was far more important than Emperor Silver or King. In fact, she may very well be the reason behind it all. But this only left more questions than answers. The Void Library had no explanations of a demon race. It seemed that the only instance occurred within the human domain itself, something that made absolutely no sense. Where was that Demoness during the conflict? Why did Sultan gloss over her as though she wasn't a big deal at all? And why was it that the more Lionel thought about this Demoness, the vaguer his conclusions about her became, almost as though someone was trying to mess with his memory? The most fear-inducing part was that Lionel could feel the movements in his dream force, almost as though a pair of slender hands was shifting his synapses and stopping them from firing properly. This person, their dream force affinity was leagues beyond his own. Chapter 1785. Published at 19th of April 2023, 10:46 and 28 seconds AM. Chapter 1785. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1785. Not bad. Lionel frowned and shook his head. He couldn't think straight until he, ironically, stopped thinking entirely. He could only barely manage to split up his deductions into several dreamscapes. Only when they were separate did the odd influence on his mind disappear. By the time he was finished, his heart was beating erratically. He couldn't imagine the kind of power it would take to influence someone's thoughts about you. This was beyond just power, it was quite literally the means of a god. Lionel was almost 100% certain that this person was aware every time their likeness was mentioned. Was this the true power of dream force? To not only be hyper-aware of your own stream of consciousness, but that of everyone else's as well? Years ago, Lionel had had a thought about this, but it was so far away from him that he couldn't even fathom it. Even now, he was in a similar situation. Despite how far he had grown, he felt like he hadn't even taken half a step toward such a goal. This person is dangerous. Lionel's jaw set. He realized almost immediately just how poor his mindset had been. This wasn't someone that he could casually catch up to with a few years of effort, and it most definitely wasn't someone he could out-scheme. This was beyond wise star order reading his mind. This person could sense his learning about them from an infinite distance away. To say that such an individual could crush him with a single finger was an exaggeration of himself. This person wouldn't even need to lift a finger. If Lionel was correct, if this person wanted to kill him, the moment they sensed him learning about them, they could directly snuff out his consciousness, and he wouldn't even be able to do anything about it. This was why Lionel had no choice but to stop trying to deduce. If he kept thinking about this person, he might very well offend them. By then, he wouldn't even know how he died, his life would just be forfeit. Unbeknownst to him, Lionel had broken out into a cold sweat, his face becoming somewhat pale. This was a feeling that he had never experienced before. What he didn't even have the presence of mind to realize was that most people who spoke of this person wouldn't even notice that they were being observed. It was precisely because Lionel's dream force affinity was so high that he could feel this fear to begin with. As the saying went, ignorance was bliss. Celtin and the others had no idea why Lionel was reacting like this, but Lionel himself felt that he had just barely escaped with his life. The problem was that losing his life was just one potential aspect. Someone with such a great control over dream force could take over his mind, alter his thoughts, and twist his personality without him even realizing. Such a thing would be a far worse fate than death. Lionel took slow and deep breaths, doing his best to slow his heart rate. The glow in his eyes slowly returned. It took him a while, but Lionel realized that even his overwhelming feeling of fear just now didn't even come from himself, it was rather this person influencing him. For them to be able to force him to react like this after what he experienced with the Emperor's Might tablet, it was clear that they were in existence no less powerful. Lionel lightly flexed his fists, the aura around him shifting. At that moment, Lionel's dream force broke through a barrier as he exhaled. His irises reflected a glassy color, almost as though one could spot a microcosm of the world within him. A silvery crystal-like energy rained down around Lionel and his 3 stars rotated. Boom! Boom! In an instant, Lionel's aura flourished, his strength soaring from Tier 1 of the 6th dimension to Tier 3. Wild fluctuations of force wafted from his body like the echoes of a roar, causing cracks to race along the ground and forcing Radlis, who was the closest to him, into a retreat. Lionel's hair danced and his clothing fluttered. The pale violet color in his eyes seemed to solidify for a moment before it receded once more. The expressions of Celtin and the others couldn't help but widen. The moment Lionel made his first breakthrough, it was clear and obvious that he wasn't on the conventional path. A breakthrough in the conventional path after the 5th dimension required a large amount of resources, but Lionel hadn't absorbed anything. In fact, his body seemed to spontaneously produce force of its own. This meant that Lionel had to be on the God path, but if he really was on the God path, just what were they witnessing? Even a single breakthrough along the God path was worthy of celebration. Even for the Cataclysm generation, the greatest geniuses of the human domain, supposedly, a single breakthrough took over a year. Many of them had already been back for over a decade, but very few had entered the 7th dimension. This made the issue obvious. Just a single breakthrough should be hard to come by. How the hell had Lionel undergone 2 right before their eyes? And the oddest part was that just a moment ago, he looked as though he had contracted some sort of sickness. The flourishing aura around Lionel slowly came to a pause and he exhaled a final breath and everything seemed to settle down properly. In an unknown location, a demoness sat on a throne of bones. Every part of her was endlessly alluring, and yet it also felt as though one couldn't see any part of her clearly. She was somehow both the most perfect representation of woman, and yet somehow very forgettable. At that moment, this demoness chuckled, even her voice causing those that heard it to go entirely soft all over. "Not bad," she said lightly. "Much better than those other 2. Occasionally missing content, please report errors in time." Chapter 1786. Published at 19th of April 2023 10:46 and 28 seconds AM Chapter 1786 If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again 1786 Libly and Dinmo Lionel stretched slightly, his body popping and crackling. Just now, he had caught a glimpse of what the highest echelons of dream force manipulation looked like, and it almost instantly enlightened him. However, even with this, he only felt that the gap between himself and this individual only widened further. Even so, the pressure of Lionel's dream force had just become more suffocating. He could feel the limitations his body placed on his seventh-dimensional dream force loosen by a great deal. It was clear that strengthening one's force manipulation could break down dimensional barriers prematurely. Breaking through via this method felt so much different than it had in the fifth dimension. Lionel felt as though he had become an elevated being, as though he was truly transcending through the dimensions, like he was shedding his mortality. He tightened and loosened his fists, feeling the air around him trembling. This was just a sixth-dimensional world and the power he felt over it was palpable. He felt like he could crush a mountain with a single stop and split the skies in two. This was true power. Even so, he didn't feel the slightest hint of complacency. The looming shadow of that figure hung over his shoulder, reminding him just how weak he was. At the same time, that hidden danger he had been sensing all this time could come around any time now. He didn't want to relax. Lionel stretched a hand forward and the bronze tablet shot up and into his hands. Take it, Lionel threw the bronze tablet over to Celtin without much hesitation. Even she was slightly stunned. She blinked, touching the cool surface. Even now, she could feel her blood stirring within herself. She had already brought the Shadow Tail lineage factor to the peak of its potential long ago. She had been waiting for this day for too long. Are you sure? There's nothing to be hesitant about. For what they did to my grandfather, the three-finger cult will definitely fall in my lifetime with or without you all, that I can promise. But if you all are serious about following through on your ancestors' intentions, then I will invest now and reap the rewards later. Lionel waved a hand. Soon, they'll be launching a mission against the Thrusting Skies sector. Prepare an elite group of 100, whatever the best you can display for now is. I will be going to the Midas and Radix families now. Originally, I was going to have you participate in this as well, but now. Lionel looked down in his hands, feeling the strength coursing through him. I don't think it's necessary anymore. Lionel turned to leave with a smile, waving a hand. If it was before and Lionel had spoken about taking out the three-finger cult without them, the members of the Umbra family might not have been able to take it seriously. However, it could be understated just how impossible it was to have such a breakthrough in the sixth dimension. To skip a level was practically unheard of. So when Lionel spoke, they subconsciously believed him. He'd expected the Midas and Radix families to be even easier to deal with than the Umbra family had with the Umbra. He had no such thing with this two-pronged family, and yet he didn't even have to shed a single hint of blood to find himself deep within their territory, face to face with their new patriarch and matriarch. Lionel knew the two of them quite well as he had fought the both of them before, Libly the petite young woman, and Dinmo, the 2.5-meter-tall behemoth of a man. After over 2 decades, their marriage had long since occurred and they might very well have children between them now. However, quite frankly, the two of them looked horrible. From what Lionel could tell, they really seemed to be on their last legs. It only took a single sweep for Lionel to understand. The Florer family? Libly managed to keep her calm after Lionel said these words, but it was Dinmo, the simple one between the two, that wore his heart too clearly on his sleeve. He reacted almost immediately when Lionel spoke, making it all too obvious that this was the case. Toward her husband, Libly could only release an exasperated sigh. The last time Dinmo had seen Lionel, he had gotten his shoulder crushed and found himself tossed into a snow globe. If not for Lionel choosing to release him back to his family, he wouldn't even be here, and it could be said that it was because of this slight goodwill that Lionel's journey here had been made so easy. Even so, Dinmo had a psychological weakness in the face of Lionel that was even worse compared to usual, so he found it very hard to hide anything, especially when Lionel was being so blunt and straightforward. Prince Lionel, we hope that you can help us out a small measure. As you know, our Midas and Radix family, and their Florer family, have never seen eye to eye because we own two halves of the same inheritance. Back during Earth's rise into the sixth dimension, the Flora family made the mistake of attacking again, and they suffered a huge loss at the hands of the Umbra family and others, which saved us quite some trouble. But in recent years they've been making a comeback and the pressure has returned tenfold, and things are only worse now given the retreat of Shield Cross Stars. If things keep trending in this direction, our family will be finished. They've always been more powerful than us, and if not for the union of our two families, we would have been crushed. I know that Imperial Prince needs help from others for the Morales family heir wars, but it's impossible for you to gain the help of the truly powerful families due to the muddy politics. If you help our family to complete our inheritance by snatching away the Flora family's secrets, I can guarantee that we will be of great help to you. Libly exhaled a breath as though it had taken up all of her energy to get this out. Chapter 1787. Published at 19th of April 2023 10:46 and 28 seconds AM. Chapter 1787. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1787 mistake HM. Lionel hummed, but didn't answer immediately. Of course, he had come here wanting to deal with Midas and Radix families, so to turn his attention toward the Flora family in exchange for their obedience wasn't too much of a problem. But the confidence in Libly's voice made him curious. He had really thought much about it before, but it seemed that this inheritance they were talking about might not be too simple. In fact, if he recalled correctly, this inheritance should be related to the Silver Empire as well. Lionel remembered the first time he had heard about the Silver Empire. While it had been intriguing, it wasn't enough for him to be in shock and awe. But suddenly, he seemed to hear their name echo wherever he went. Libly squirmed somewhat nervously. Although she had said about whether or not Lionel would really help them. Much like one tended to do in negotiations, she had exaggerated their position a bit. Whether or not they would be able to maximize the inheritance or not wasn't something she was sure of. In fact, she wasn't even certain what the Silver Empire inheritance would look like when it fused into one. Explain your half of the inheritance to me, Lionel finally said. Libly exhaled. So long as Lionel was asking questions, there was a chance. The inheritance is a bit difficult to describe. But it boils down to my Radix family's Radix cube and Dinmo's Midas family's strong bodies. The Midas families is much easier to explain. They are able to use large amounts of fire force materials to strengthen their bodies. It not only ups their fire affinity, but it also gives their body a durability and recoverability most do not have. When you returned Dinmo to us, he was half dead with disastrous brain injuries, but he was able to survive thanks to this. He's even able to heal his body just by taking in high-quality fire force, though the limit is dependent on his own affinity, the strength of his talent and his overall strength itself. Lionel's eyes narrowed when he heard this. Dinmo had, indeed, been half dead when Lionel returned him to his family. In fact, he remembered being shocked that he survived his blow at all. However, this wasn't why Lionel was intrigued. He just felt that Libly's words sounded greatly familiar. My Radix family's Radix cube is a lot more complicated. We are able to form a special force within us that can be used to influence and change metals. Once this metal is changed through the use of our bronze force, it gains a symbiotic relationship with us and we are able to take it within our bodies. This allows us to create crafts that can be controlled like limbs extending from our bodies. We nurture our Radix cubes through our lives and we grow along with them. As we get more powerful, so too do they. The more Libly talked, the more sparks flew within Lionel's dreamscape. But even so, he couldn't understand why. Time and time again, the name Morales and metal synergy lineage factor came up. But what did portions of an inheritance from the Silver Empire have to do with the Morales family? Swallowing fire force to strengthen one's body. That sounded eerily similar to metal body. Fusing with metals and controlling it like an extension of yourself. That sounded eerily similar to divine armor. These seemingly unrelated matters all of a sudden fell entirely too related when they were reframed. Lionel's gaze turned sharp. What about the Flora family, then? We have to be more cautious, things aren't looking good. News that the 4 families were destroyed has been circulating, although that might just be a rumor right now. We should at least confirm if it's true before we take another step. A voice of reason echoed in a secret meeting room. This location was none other than an underground lair of the Flora family, but the people here were entirely split. The individual who spoke was an old woman who went by Elder Sherry. She looked especially kind, and though her face was filled with wrinkles, she had a rosiness that seemed very healthy. Out of her graying hair, branches of trees seemed to grow and blooming red cherries became like ornaments to her style. On her shoulder, a beautiful white dove sat, picking at the red cherries from time to time with a blooming happiness in its eyes. By the time it finished eating one, a second would appear in its place almost immediately. This woman exuded endless vitality and was one of the 3 strongest warriors of the Flora family. Even so, she seemed to be in the minority on this day. Elders Seward and Roselia were entirely opposed to her views. "I disagree," Elder Seward, an old man who seemingly had seaweed in place of his hair, spoke out. "If anything, those rumors should make us hurry all the more. That boy is the very one who killed little Belize back when he was just in the 5th dimension. Now that he's returned, what chance do we stand if we do not finally complete our ancestors' wishes and fuse the final inheritance together?" Elder Sherry shook her head. "You only need to take the Midas and Radix families as an example. Just because we have to be able to fuse it. If it was so easy, why haven't their Midas and Radix families fused their quarter pieces together in all this time? Isn't it precisely because we can make use of a full half while they can only separate it that we are so much more powerful than they are? Even after centuries of intermarrying, they've only just finally produced a young genius that can use the 2. By the time we succeed in producing a genius who can fuse all 3 pieces, our actions would have long since offended the Ascension Empire to the point where we would be eradicated. By then, our hard work would fall in the hands of others. I believe that this is a foolish decision that will lead to the downfall of our family." Chapter 1788. Published at 19th of April 2023, 10:46 and 28 seconds AM. Chapter 1788. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1788 Choice. Roselia and Seward had difficulty rebutting Sherry's words. This was something the 2 AHD, obviously, been quite aware of. But they were simply unwilling, and what made it all worse was that this had been caused by their greed. Had they not attacked Earth back then, with how much the Ascension Empire had on their plate, how could they have time to deal with a scuffle between 2 6-dimensional families? Had they not been on Earth's radar, they could have used this moment to make a final push into Midas and Radix territory, swallowing them up and secretly taking advantage of commotion to retreat in secret to digest their gains. But now it was difficult even to make that argument. They were stuck between a rock and a hard place. They could either sit back and hope that Earth would forget their transgressions and not deal with them even after resolving their issues in the future, or they could rush forward with this and inevitably pop back up on their radar. Either way, their fates didn't seem to be in their own hands. "Then we'll just have to accept the offer," Roselia eventually said coldly. When this was said, even Sherry hesitated, not saying anything immediately. Her kind features seemed marred by worry. If this sort of choice was made, there rarely was no going back. Those people seemed to be very interested in their inheritance, but if their proposal was accepted, then they would have very little control of where things went from here. Ultimately, there were 2 predictable roads between them and one wild card. If they sat back and did nothing, they would either eventually be destroyed in the future, or they would continue to wallow in mediocrity. If they attacked, they would offend the Ascension Empire, and if they accepted this proposal, any of those things could also happen, but there was also a small chance that they could break out of their cocoon and bloom. It was clear what kind of philosophy the Flora family usually had. Since they had dared to attack Earth back then, even while knowing the kind of sticky situation they might get themselves into. However, even so, they were used to doing risk assessments as well. Back then, Earth was still a fledgling world and they seemed vulnerable. But now, they had already grown into a behemoth in comparison to them. At the same time, if those people dared to do as they said, then it was likely that they were another behemoth, one that their family also couldn't afford to offend. The question was, should they make a deal with the Devil Toes Cape a demon? Sherry couldn't make this decision. Back then she hadn't stopped the family from attacking Earth because she too understood the concept that if one wasn't moving forward, they were moving backward. If everyone around you was improving while you, yourself, was stagnant, it really was no different from moving in the reverse direction. As a family that had survived many centuries to make it to this point, even conquering a galaxy to themselves, they couldn't afford to take a step back, especially since so many were eyeing Earth's territory right now. Worst come to worst, they would just allow their world's spirit to dissipate and become true citizens of Earth. But if they were ostracized and their territory was taken over first before they could do even that, then what chance did they stand? The three head elders looked toward one another and fell into silence. It seemed that they had made their choice. They didn't need to say anything to understand one another's conclusions. However, before they could take any further steps, a commotion broke out. As Lionel walked, he had to admit that the feeling of moist, soft grass beneath his bare feet felt almost too good. The Flora family territory was indeed a beautiful one. Exotic plants of all sorts bloomed in the surroundings, filling the air with earthy and delicate fragrant that soothed the soul. It even somewhat reminded Lionel of the scent of rain, but it was perpetual. He didn't waste any time and had come directly to their main planet. He truly didn't believe that anyone here could stop him. Even up until this point, he hadn't felt it necessary to take his hands out of his pockets and he was enjoying the scenery more than anything. The shouts of warriors and alarms began to blare, ruining the ambience somewhat. However, every time they exposed their position, another swirling mass of emulation spatial force would shoot through the air, impaling them all. The Flora family members were simply too weak. Lionel was already able to kill one of their strongest warriors and geniuses back when he was in the 5th dimension. Now that he was in Tier 3 of the 6th dimension, what chance did they stand now? In what felt like just a few minutes, Lionel had already made it to the main gates of their estate. The entirety of planet Flora was covered in foliage and plant life, even the water sources were covered in plants of all kinds, making it look like a planet off-green from above. Their main estate was really no different at all. It was hard to tell if it was a real fortress at all because even its sturdy constructions were covered in plant life. Boom! A rush of spatial force came out from Lionel like the swing of a hammer. In just a single strike, the tall gates deformed, a dent that was over 20 meters across and over 5 meters deep appearing right at its very center. Lionel raised an eyebrow. It survived that? It's actually repairing itself too. Lionel was a bit reluctant to use fire force in such a beautiful place, but that didn't mean he would if it came to it. For now, though, it didn't feel necessary. Lionel's gaze flashed. Boom! The gates flung open with such force that they were ripped off their hinges. Occasionally missing content. Please report errors in time. Chapter 1789. Published at 19th of April 2023 10:46 and 28 seconds AM. Chapter 1789. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1789. Too late. The gates flew up like artillery shells, falling in the distance with a deafening boom. At that moment, all the Flora family members that had been scrambling behind the gates froze, looking toward Lionel at the same time. They knew well how good their defenses were. It should have taken an entire troop of powerful warriors to even damage it. How could just a single person not only burst through it, but even do so with such force that the gates flew from their hinges like that? Fear took deep root within them even as Sherry, Seward and Roselia all charged out from the depths of their family estate, their eyes widening when they landed in Lionel. Although they hadn't personally been there to see this young man back then, how could they not learn of the truth from others by this point? Lionel had been able to kill Belizzi at the 5th dimension, but now he was already in the 6th dimension. Just what kind of monster had he become? The three head elders smiled bitterly in their hearts. They never thought that they wouldn't even get the chance to make the hard choice. Just when they thought they had time, their worst fears became a reality almost instantly. Even if they laid down their lives to battle Lionel right this moment, would it even change anything? The strongest among them, Sherry, was only at Tier 6 of the 6th dimension, the other two were still at Tier 5. They didn't feel like they stood a single chance. Lionel continued to walk forward. His steps were absolutely silent, but for some reason they felt as loud and powerful gongs in their heads. Sherry sighed. Is it necessary to take things this far, Imperial Prince? Our family offended yours once in the past, but we haven't crossed any lines since then. Doesn't Earth need more allies now? Lionel gazed towards Sherry. His eyes couldn't help but narrow. When he looked toward this woman, he couldn't muster up any emotions outside of goodwill. She looked too kind, too fragile, too warm. But that was exactly why Lionel immediately put his guard up. There was absolutely no reason why he, who had such good control over himself, should be unable to make logical deductions about a person's character. At the very least, he should be able to make assessments deeper than what he could see at a skin-deep level. Lionel's eyes shifted toward the white dove on her shoulder, his expression becoming expressionless once more. Have you been? Lionel asked lightly. 9 days ago at Planet Vultrix. 17 days ago at the EU Moon System. 22 days ago Prolax Moon System. 27 days ago at Raytrise Asteroid System. These are just incidents within the last month where your family has launched an assault against others within Ascension Empire territory. The expressions of the three elders changed. Although they hadn't been personally a part of those operations, they knew of them. Each one of them had targeted the Midas and Radix families, dealing them huge losses. They had had many more planned, but the news of the destruction of the four families had stopped them in their tracks. Never had they thought that the Ascension Empire had paid somic attention to them. Could it be that they never stood a chance right from the very beginning? What these three didn't know was that the Ascension Empire had, indeed, not had any time to worry about them. Instead, this was just information gathered by the networks of the Etching Metal Organization, an organization the vast majority had no idea existed, and for those that might have an inkling, it was only that, suspicions. Let alone the Flora family, Lionel had detailed analysis of the micro and macro movements of every family and organization within Earth's territories. Sherry didn't know how to respond to Lionel's words. If before they had plausible deniability, the specifics of Lionel's words made it obvious that their denial would mean nothing, and even further, that he likely had proof. The head elders smiled bitterly and the atmosphere fell into solemnity. At that moment, a laughter echoed through the quiet. Lionel slowly turned his head toward a building covered in foliage in the distance. He had noticed this young man long ago, but he had simply made the assumption that he was just another member of the Flora family. He wasn't actively scanning everyone, after all. He couldn't be expected to recognize all of their faces as he had never been here before. However, the moment he paid attention to this young man, Lionel realized that his soul was different compared to everyone else here. He knew immediately that he wasn't related to the Flora family. When Lionel realized this, he became more serious about scanning the air, his powerful internal sight surging through the region. 2. 5. 6 of them including him. All right. The young man was caught off guard by the fact that Lionel immediately turned his attention calmness about him. But, what shocked him even more was what came after this. I haven't killed any members of the Three-Finger Cult in a long while. Why don't you stop laughing and draw your blade? If you don't, I won't give you another chance to. The expression of the young man and the other 5 changed almost immediately. They never thought that Lionel would be able to actually name their organization so casually. How could he even tell? For the current Lionel, such a feat was all too easy. Scanning a person's soul told you a lot more about them than just generally scanning their bodies. With just a look, Lionel could feel the familiar aura of a lineage factor that he, himself, had, and thus people obviously weren't from his Morales, Luxnix, or Fox families. In that case, there was only one explanation. Lionel finally took his hands out of his pockets and flipped a palm to reveal the radiant white lion bow. Too late. Don't say I didn't give you a chance. Occasionally missing content, please report errors in time. Chapter 1790. Published at 19th of April 2023 10:46 and 29 seconds AM. Chapter 1790. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1790 Twin Bang. The head of the young man snapped backward, a bloody hole appearing on his forehead. He seemed to enter a slight lull for a moment before his head exploded, a rain of blood and gore spreading in all directions. Lionel didn't show the slightest hint of mercy. The three-finger cult was an existence that was akin to the oil to his water. As many as he met was exactly as many as he would kill. For making his father show him such an expression, they deserved nothing short of death. Sherry and the others shivered. They had no idea that young man was still here. He was the one who had come to them with the earlier proposition. But they had never thought that rather than leaving, these individuals would have still been here monitoring their movements. Even though they had eventually decided to side with these individuals, didn't this mean that they had never really had a choice to begin with? And yet, this person they had feared had been shredded to pieces by just a single attack of Lionel's. Lionel's fingers flickered and more arrows appeared from the segmented cube. He knocked 3 at once, pulling back in one fluid motion as his hair fluttered in the air. He locked onto several targets at once. In his eyes, they might as well have been standing nose to nose. In such a situation, how could they avoid him? SHUU. 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 Lionel released his bowstring, the roar of a white lion echoing with a sonorous resonance. At that moment, the other 5 who had all been hiding in the general vicinity, seemingly with the intention of blending into the family, all erupted with their greatest strengths at the same time. 3 punched out at the same time, shattering Lionel's arrows. Even so, 2 of them grimaced in pain as the bones in their hands fractured, and the last of them was even more unlucky, losing their entire fist to just a single arrow. All 3 stumbled back, their steps causing the ground to crack and shatter. Lionel had already pulled out 3 more arrows before the first ones landed, pulling back with a movement just as fluid and releasing. The world seemed to be devoid of all noise, the whistling of Lionel's arrows fading as they became faster and faster. The remaining 2 hidden experts shot into the air, radiant silver-black wings extending from their backs. Lionel recognized it immediately as the dusky steel bat lineage factor. The last time Lionel faced the three-finger cult, they had even sent someone with the Aurora Black Panda lineage factor. The fact that this seemed to be the best this squadron could muster, it was obvious that they had sent a far weaker lineup this time around. Even so, they were actually arrogant enough to provoke Lionel despite knowing his identity. It could only be said that they had overestimated themselves. Lionel's 3 arrows spiraled around one another, appearing before one of the flying experts as though he had already guessed exactly what would happen. Pung! 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 The expert quickly protected himself with his steel wings. The dusky steel bat was well known for both its speed and the defense of its wings. Even so, Lionel's attack left 3 heavy dents in the enemy's wings, sending him flying into the distance. Before he could even react, a 4th arrow appeared before his forehead, shattering his skull to pieces. The last look in his eyes was nothing more than sheer moments. He couldn't believe he had died so easily. What he didn't know was that Lionel was impressed that any one of them had survived more than just a single arrow from him. The fact they could just went to show the sheer amount of talent was raising. Anyone who could survive more than a single strike from him while being in the 6th dimension had a right to be proud of themselves. These were Lionel's thoughts. Twang! Lionel's arrow suddenly exploded with speed in the air, catching the second dusky steel bat lineage factor wielder off guard. Seeing how their companion died, she had thought that she would at least be able to block the first strike. But the sudden acceleration of Lionel's arrow caught her completely off guard. His head snapped back with a bloody hole. There was simply no chance as her head exploded before her body even hit the ground. Lionel had already knocked 4 more arrows. If one was following his pupils, before his enemies even faced a fatal strike, he had already looked away from them. The confidence in his archery was untouchable. With a bow in hand, he was invincible. Lionel released his arrows, but this time, his gaze narrowed. Even when it was just a mere 3 meters from his target, his expression didn't become any better. To anyone else, there was absolutely nothing there, but Lionel didn't seem happy at all. As expected, when the arrows entered a 2-meter, a figure appeared from seemingly nowhere, a delicate hand waving through the air. As though this beauty was plucking grapes from a vine, she snatched Lionel's arrows out of the air, caressing them in her fingers and cradling them to a stop. "They are no longer of any use, we will leave now," she said lightly. "I've gotten what we need." Her voice was beautiful beyond compare. As her white robes fluttered along with her veil, she looked like an absolute goddess, and her voice only made one want to protect her future. Battling her would be the furthest thing from anyone's mind. And yet, this wasn't something that Lionel was thinking about. Rather, despite the obstruction of the veil and the fact his visual senses wanted to tell him that he had never met this person before, his far sharper senses were telling him a different story. "Anya?" Lionel mumbled. "No, you aren't her." "A twin sister?" Lionel seemed to speak only for himself, but the ears of those here were too powerful given their dimensional levels. Chapter 1791. Published at 19th of April 2023, 10:46 and 29 seconds AM. Chapter 1791. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1791 Death. The woman seemed to look toward Lionel for the first time, but it was for no other reason than the mention of Anya. She didn't seem to see Lionel at all. In fact, it looked as though she was looking through him, a feeling that many of Lionel's enemies had experienced at his hands. However, Lionel didn't seem to care very much. True confidence and arrogance stemmed from thinking little of what others thought of you. Those who would be enraged by such a thing clearly had something to overcompensate for. As far as Lionel saw it, this was only confirmation of his thoughts. Lionel's gaze shifted toward the ring on the woman's finger, his gaze flashing. His Bao domain lineage factor activated and his vision seemed to implode with spatial force. This was the truest extent of the Bao domain lineage factor, the capability to activate force from your sight. Since Lionel couldn't make use of the full lineage factor since he lacked the complete form, he could still accomplish this much. His vision pierced through the veil and entered the spatial device on the young woman's finger. In an instant, he saw everything within her private ring, ranging from her undergarments all the way to what he was truly looking for. An inconspicuous object was neatly tucked away in the corner. Although he had never seen it before, Lionel was absolutely certain that this was where the half of Silver Empire's inheritance was. Before he had gotten to it, this woman had made it there first. At first, the young woman was confused about what she was seeing. But after a moment, she seemed to have deduced what had happened. In one moment, she was stunned, and in the next, her placid glaze was marred by fury. She seemed to forget that there were people she was here to take away. Her aura alone caused the three that had managed to survive to erupt into a cloud of crimson. Lionel didn't react much to this at all. He assumed that she was angry because he had seen her personal property, but he simply didn't care. In fact, the more time she spent angry instead of using whatever method she had prepared to escape, the better. He obviously couldn't let her leave with the inheritance. As for seeing her undergarments, if he really wanted to, he could see her naked right this moment. Most could use their own personal strength to cancel out the Bao domain lineage factor, but Lionel had a very unique set of abilities that made it very difficult to do so unless you had a large power advantage over him. If this woman was truly Anya's twin sister, there was no doubt that she was a top-class beauty, one rarely seen, no less than Aina. But he simply didn't care. No beauty outside of Aina herself had ever moved him, and he doubted that would ever change. This woman could be stripped naked before him and he simply wouldn't care. "You have a death wish," she said coldly. Lionel didn't respond, his bow disappearing in place of a white gold spear. His absolute spear domain flourished, an illusory cyclone of gold dancing around him. The aura was so oppressive that the members of the Flora family were forced into a retreat, buildings in the surrounding area threatening to collapse. The young woman, Harmony, took a step forward. But just as she did so, she looked up and her face seemed to scowl beneath her veil. Clearly, someone was communicating with her. She looked back toward Lionel and sparks seemed to fly in her beautiful eyes, her ample chest heaving. She seemed to be memorizing Lionel's face for the future, her murderous intent towering like a malevolent tornado. After a moment, she exhaled a breath and flipped her palm over to reveal a plaque which she immediately poured her force into. Strong spatial fluctuations emitted in all directions until she was enveloped with a swirling portal. She vanished. However, from start to finish, Lionel hadn't moved. A moment later, Harmony took a step out and her pupils constricted when she realized that she was actually standing in the same exact spot. Her head turned back to find that Lionel was looking toward her indifferently. Valiant seal, Lionel said lightly. At that moment, in the surroundings, 4 pillars rose out of the ground, causing the earth to crackle and quake. The pillars pulled themselves out of the ground, radiating with beautiful bronze and silver lights bloomed along his body. Harmony realized at that moment that the space was entirely sealed, and not by some treasure, but rather by Lionel himself. Her gaze couldn't help but narrow. This was no normal feat, not at all. Lionel began to walk forward. Finger cult members appear before me is the number that will die. You overestimate yourself a bit too much. Harmony regained her composure. If Lionel could see into her spatial ring, he could obviously see what trump cards she had in hand and would obviously be aware of what methods of escape she could use. From that moment, he had already prepared a counter for it. Lionel wasn't just talented, he was scheming and highly intelligent. Even so, I think the one overestimating themselves is you. Keeping me here is the worst mistake you could have made. You had a path choosing death. Harmony's white dress fluttered, a silvery black energy wafting out in all directions from her, the aura of a Tier 4 expert coming out from her in waves. Lionel immediately recognized this energy as the very same energy which had dissolved all the strength from his arrows. Feeling it now, he was even more certain of what it was. Death force. A pair of white horns grew from Harmony's delicate forehead, her pupils growing to the point they almost swallowed up her irises entirely, forcing them to become rings of gold. Her white hair fluttered, being contrasted with the silvery black energy. Lionel was sure now. This was the Death Pulse Deer lineage factor, the 5th lineage factor, a pinnacle 8th dimensional lineage factor. Harmony reached out with a hand and a scythe formed of white bone and creamy pearl manifested, the pole arm and menacingly curved blade connected by a glistening red ruby twice the size of an adult's head. The pole arm alone was at least 3 meters and the curve of the white blade was at least 2 meters. Shying. Shirring. Shirring. You want to kill death? Harmony laughed, her gorgeous voice still causing those who heard it to go soft. Fool. I'm going to enjoy skinning that handsome face off of your skull. Harmony's scythe danced and spun in her hands before she suddenly attacked. Chapter 1792. Published at 19th of April 2023 10:46 and 29 seconds AM. Chapter 1792. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1792 Seance. Lionel's gaze flashed, his spear piercing forward. Clang. The ground imploded, the buildings in the surroundings cracking apart. In that moment, it looked as though a perfect sphere had expanded in the center of the battlefield before vanishing, leaving nothing but a vast nothingness in its wake. The two separated and instantly shot forward once again, their weapons crossing back and forth, dancing between glancing blows and all-out attacks that sent them both flying dozens of meters backward. In just a few exchanges, it felt like the entire Flora family estate had been razed to the ground, their power far too strong for a 6th-dimensional world to handle with any sort of ease. Creeping up around him, eating at his own force. It swallowed it all with more forcefulness than even anarchic force seemed capable of, and yet it was precisely because of his experience with anarchic force that Lionel was somewhat able to deal with it. A pair of cold gazes met across a duo of crossing blades. Harmony's scythe sliced downward, shifting the weight of Lionel's spear and parrying it to the side. Her hips twisted and her body spun, 3 quick strikes descended toward Lionel's off-balance figure. The blade moved so quickly that its afterimages looked like a blooming lotus of scythe force, wafting an eerie deadly aura. Clang. 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 Lionel's absolute spear domain raged, rotating with such speed that it deflected all 3 blows. At the same time, Lionel's spear tip seemed to vanish into the void. It looked like he had been pierced by Harmony, her parry causing him to be off the mark by a few feet. And yet, the moment his spear tip vanished, it appeared at her throat as though it had always been there. Harmony's pupils constricted, however her expression remained calm. Oh. She pursed her cherry lips, her veil fluttering as she released the sound of a soothing harmony. It sounded almost like the seance of a religious cult. There didn't seem to be any force behind it at all. In fact, it was no different from the delicate hum of a young girl. And yet, Lionel's spear felt as though it had met an immovable object. A gentle pulsing light radiated out in all directions. When it met Lionel's absolute spear domain, it passed through it as though its substance at all. When it met Lionel's bronze aura, the outcome was the exact same. It crashed into Lionel's body, sending him flying backward. Despite the slow speed of the pulsing light, Lionel felt as though he had been hit by a speeding truck, his body flying out like an arrow out of a bow. At the same time, a dense, dark energy began to eat at his skin and the force within his body. Lionel grunted, a surge of vital star force rushing through his body and crushing the death pulse force. He spun through the air, trying to regain his bearings. However, before he could, Harmony appeared above him, her scythe swinging down like the vicious stinger of a scorpion. Lionel's expression remained cold and indifferent, his spear piercing upward. His blade seemed to draw a line in the skies. Even in such a compromised position, he didn't seem to lose any momentum or torque at all. Bang! Their blades crossed, but Harmony pulled back faster than usual, suddenly kicking down toward Lionel, her bare heel colliding with his sternum. Lionel's body shot downward like a meteor, a harsh whistling sound echoing through the surroundings. Just as he was about to land on the ground, he flipped, landing heavily on his feet. All around him, the earth shattered and crumbled. Up in the skies, high above, Harmony spread out her arms and legs like a starfish, her scythe being held tightly in one hand as she free fell. The wind rushed by her and fluttered her robes, a malevolent expression on her face as her tall horns suddenly began to spark. At first, it just looked like subtle arc-soft lighting, but very quickly, it was as though the void had been torn apart and a small rotating black hole-like sphere took form, pulsing every time it expanded in size. In just a few breaths, it was over 10 meters in diameter, and Harmony opened her soft cherry lips once more, her veil wildly flapping in the wind. "Yu-yu-yu-yu-yu-yu-yu." A sonorous call echoed and the pulsing black sphere suddenly appeared on the ground right above Lionel, crashing down with a speed that was nigh impossible to react to. Lionel felt as though an entire world had suddenly and lakes began to tower into the skies, forming tsunamis that flooded the surrounding green forests. The magnetic poles were knocked out of alignment, causing the perpetual spring-like temperatures to shift, forming a deathly heat in some regions and a frosty cold in others. At the same time, unearthed volcanoes began to erupt and earthquakes ravaged the surroundings. It felt as though if Harmony's target was the planet itself and not Lionel, she could have wiped it all out with just that blow alone. Harmony was enveloped by the pillar of her own attack, but she continued to descend, her scythe slicing downward and splitting it into two. Her gaze was filled with a fiery light. She wanted Lionel's head. She hit the ground. Bang! Roar! Her palms slapped together, catching Harmony's scythe blade before it could descend any further. The claps echoed like the roars of thunder. Occasionally missing content. Please report errors in time. Chapter 1793. Published at 19th of April 2023, 10:46 and 29 seconds AM. Chapter 1793. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1793 Defensive Path. Lionel's three-headed and six-armed dark gold panda construct roared, the bellow of chest dispersing the death pulse force in the surroundings. Four of its palms clasped around the scythe, stopping it in its tracks. Its remaining two palms struck out at the same time, aiming for Harmony's body without the slightest care for preserving her life. Harmony was stunned for a moment with the sudden appearance of the panda construct. She felt that there was a familiar aura coming from it, but it was too different from the Aurora Black Panda lineage factor she was familiar with. If she had time, she might have been able to deduce what was happening, but before she could, those two palms had already appeared before her. Harmony's surprise turned to a sneer. A construct made of force was what she feared the least. Second before her death pulse force corroded all the force it was constructed out of. However, before her death pulse force could cause Lionel's panda construct to collapse, Lionel's lips moved. Lotus domain. Harmony's pupils constricted. The change was almost instant. The death pulse force she was so proud of became a force she couldn't even recognize, turning from a silvery black to a radiant white gold. The white gold force exuded a surging vitality and life force that completely countered her death-type force. Bang! The two palms landed on her body. With the size of the panda, each was 3 feet long alone, so it truly felt as though her entire body was suddenly being ravaged. The air was entirely knocked out of her body and she shot backward, leaving fiery streaks in the skies. What shocked Lionel, though, was that she managed to hold onto her scythe, flying backward with a tight hold on it. Even so, Lionel's starry light domain activated and he appeared above her flying body in a single instant, striking down with a rain of palms. She managed to block a few, but once again, Lionel's last 2 palms were her downfall. They grabbed her 2 legs with a great force as though he would rip her apart from the bottom up. However, Harmony's body was far too sturdy. So instead, Lionel's panda construct's torso torqued, swinging Harmony upward before throwing her down to the ground with a vicious momentum. Blood flew from Harmony's lips, her body curving into a U shape. Her body looked far too fragile to withstand such a beating. Lionel stood above, his lotus domain still suffocating Harmony's death pulse force as his emulation spatial forces urged to form his white gold spear. His absolute spear domain erupted with such a blinding light that the entirety of his panda's construct was swallowed up by the rotating gold cyclone. He pierced downward with all the momentum he could muster, space trembling and cracking beneath his might. Suddenly. Screech. A malevolent dark force rose into the skies. Lionel felt as though his spear construct had entered a quagmire it was unable to extricate itself from. His pupils constricted. Shadow Sovereign. Lionel had expected this to be a possibility. The concentration of Shadow Sovereign talents that the Three-Finger Cult had were far too many, and he had a feeling that Harmony's use of it and her shadow world was on a completely different level. Harmony vanished from the ground in a swirl of darkness, appearing in the skies with 9 pulsing black holes hanging around her body. Even standing a measure away, Lionel felt as though his force was being forcefully snatched and twisted into a vast nothingness. His expression couldn't help but turn serious for the first time. Shadow sovereignty had many paths. Blackstar had the greatest ability to bolster his mimicry by feeding the blood he had to this point. Harmony seemed to be most talented in the defensive path, but it wasn't just that. Boom! At that moment, the 9 black holes rotated and a familiar force shot out at Lionel, appearing before him in the blink of an eye. Lionel recognized it almost immediately. This was the very same force he had just applied to his spear strike. Now it was coming back at him even faster than before. Lionel's panda construct roared, swinging out 2 pairs of arms to the side and forming a large amount of dark blue force. Lionel's gaze flashed and he completed a magic art, taking the formed void star force and forming them into a pair of shields. If members of Shield Cross Stars had been here, they would have felt that this shield looked eerily familiar. However, in comparison to theirs, Lionel's was hundreds of times more powerful. How could it not be? It was formed using the strongest water force in all of existence. Boom! Lionel's shields shuddered for only a moment before they dispelled the attack, but in that next instant, Harmony had appeared to his side. It seemed that even if she focused on this aspect of her shadow sovereignty, it didn't mean that she couldn't use the other aspects. In fact, with her talent she might not have any weaknesses whatsoever. Harmony looked like the incarnation of a demon warrior goddess, her white gown streaking with black fog and her golden irises turning into a fierce dark gold while the whites of her eyes turned entirely dark. Even the scythe in her hands was now pulsing with black veins. When she swung down, space shuddered and collapsed, the single line of crimson blood trickling from her cherry lips seeming to be particularly tragic. But even so, her strength was menacing and her backdrop was the eruption of pillars of lava. Die! Her voice was entirely ice-cold, the harmony seeming to make her strike even more powerful than before. Lionel pierced outward to meet her scythe with the hands not holding his twin pair of shields, but his brows jumped almost instantly. Her scythe passed through his spear construct as though it wasn't there, even severing his panda construct in 2 and aiming right for his real body. Lionel roared and thrust out with his real spear, but it almost instantly cracked and then split in 2, the scythe continuing toward his head and chest. Chapter 1794. Published at 19th of April 2023 10:46 and 29 seconds AM. Chapter 1794. If audio player doesn't work, Press stop then play button again. 1794 Radiance. Lionel's heart skipped a beat. He could vaguely feel the power of Harmony's strike, but the scariest part about it was the fact that much of it seemed to be hidden in a completely separate dimension. This was an incredibly profound strike, a singular strike that let Lionel know that Harmony's current weapon mastery was even beyond his own despite his own improvement. Somehow, she had layered her real self and her shadow, attacking at once in both the real world and the shadow world. As a result, her strike was twice as powerful as it should be. On top of that, her force manipulation had reached a realm where she could fuse her darkness force and her death pulse force. One worked in the void, swallowing everything, while the other worked in reality, crumbling all force it met. Together, they were too profound for Lionel's current Lotus domain to undo, and the result. Lionel shot backward, striking with his fifth and sixth palms at the air to gather up the momentum he needed to move. But even so, he was a step late. The scythe sliced through half of head and through his chest. He continued to move backward. Harmony's gaze was malevolent as she watched Lionel shoot backward. That strike would have been enough to kill any other enemy. She stood in the skies like a deity, her white hair fluttering and wisps of fog dancing out from the edges of her eyes. Boom! Lionel crashed against the ground, a ghastly wound descended from his forehead down through his chest and even his heart. Harmony snorted and turned to leave, her anger still not quite satiated. But, she had already wasted enough time here, she needed to leave. However, before she could take a step, a surge of light force caused her head to snap back. Her eyes widened as Lionel stood to his feet, instant recovery, still rotating around him. As the radiant white gold force fell onto him, Lionel roared, a pulsing halo appearing above his head and a shining golden spear crown appearing at the center of his forehead. Lionel's halo began to descend down his body, reaching his feet and bouncing upward to slowly manifest the image of an armor that caused the air to tremble and quake. Bits and pieces of the armor opened and closed as though it was a living, breathing entity, plumes of force jetting out from its joints and causing space to vibrate. The armor looked as though it was formed of polished pearls, reflecting a milky whiteness in some regions and a delicate jade color in others. Where Lionel's mouth should be there were pulsing air vents. Every time he took a breath, cyclones of wind would form in all directions, causing the runes on the armor to light up as they flooded his body with the vitality it needed. Lionel held his broken spear in his hands. After a moment, he flipped them into the air, allowing them to vanish into thin air, only to be replaced by a solid black rod. The force in the surroundings shook. It felt as though every breath Lionel took, a strong tide would surge toward him as though all the force in the world was in complete harmony with him. Lionel spread his arms wide, a tsunami of force rushing toward him and lifting him into the air as the vents on his armor continued to open and close, their countless moving parts making it look like a true symbiotic existence. Boom! The skies cracked as 3 shimmering blue stars appeared to Lionel's back. With every rotation, an additional flood of vital star force would fill Lionel's armor, causing the runes to glow with a more permanent light and the pale jade to turn into a roval blue. Lionel took a step forward and he vanished. When he appeared again, his black rod was already piercing forward. The black fog that perpetually hung around it quaked to life, rotating fiercely and forming a drill bit that sliced space itself apart. Harmony reacted quickly, swinging her scythe to meet Lionel's spear, but the strength of Lionel's strike caught her completely off guard. For a moment, she thought she was facing someone entirely different, someone with the strength of a descending mountain. Her body was sent flying. It felt as though their blades had just crossed, but in the single blink of an eye she had already been buried in the earth below, her eyes widened with shock. The drill on the tip of Lionel's black rod dispersed before accumulating again. A menacing blade formed before it grew explosively in size. In just a breath it had already grown to over half a kilometer long, towering into the skies. It would have completely dwarfed Lionel's figure if not for how bright the blue stars to his back were. Lionel roared, his spear force surging to coat the enormous blade as he swung downward. There was simply nowhere to dodge. Screech! Harmony's lips part and she released another devastating banshee-like scream. This time, it left tears in space itself, the rippling lines of sound barrier shattering, leaving glass-like shards of space sprinkling out in all directions. The ground around her shattered and the planet seemed to be on its last legs. Harmony was swallowed up by the enormous blade, being forced to tunnel through the earth out of no will of her own. Blood flowed from her lips, but the coldness in her gaze only grew. With a flash, she vanished, thinking to take Lionel off guard. She appeared right to his side and it was entirely too late to retrieve such a large blade. However, how could Lionel fall for the same thing twice? Harmony had only just appeared when she found a fist twisting into her gut. It was almost as though she had delivered herself to be hit. Plumes of vital star force jetting out from the elbow joints of Lionel's divine armor, causing his arm to bulge and his power to skyrocket. Boom! The sound of the collision was akin to a clap of thunder. Harmony finally felt her ribs shatter, shards of bone skewering her inner organs through. Lionel's fist twisted once, grinding into her body before she flew out so far that she soared into orbit. Lionel's starry light domain bloomed, his range expanding by over 1,000 times the usual, reaching a point where he was capable of enveloping the entire planet. His half-a-kilometer-long blade vanished into thin air and he appeared in the depths of space, his hand having grabbed onto a handful of Harmony's hair. She hung limply, blood falling from her lips in a flood. Her gaze was in somewhat of a daze as her mind turned to fog. She couldn't remember whether she was in battle or not, her pain clouding her thoughts in confusion. Suddenly, Harmony seemed to snap awake. "Leave me alone," she suddenly shrieked. Lionel thought that she was speaking to him until his lock onto her soul heard something odd. "You'll lose without me." The moment the voice that sounded eerily similar to Harmony sounded, an eruption of white force surged from her, sending Lionel's hand flying upward. If not for the protection of his armor, he might have lost it entirely along with his arm. At that moment, Harmony's eyes opened, her gaze sharpening. One of her eyes had lost its whites completely, falling into darkness with irises of dark gold, the other shone a blinding white light with irises of pure gold. The oppressive aura of a sovereign descended again. Radiant sovereign. Within his helmet, Lionel's brows jumped. Chapter 1795. Published at 19th of April 2023 10:46 and 29 seconds AM. Chapter 1795. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1795. Natural light. Lionel's gaze sharpened. This feeling. It was a lot more similar to Anya. Were they not twins? No, this was definitely a different woman, he wouldn't make a mistake about that. Lionel knew there was no coincidence that Anya's twin was here. It was clear and obvious to him that Anya must be a member of the Three-Finger Cult. This also made him recontextualize everything she had ever said to him. Even down to her saving that he was supposedly dangerous. Just as Lionel was thinking, a piercing light suddenly appeared before him. Lionel's reaction speed couldn't be compared to before. He struck out with a palm, 2 more stars appearing to his back. These carried a dense dark bluish-black color, rippling like the ocean waves in the depths of the night. Boom! The pillar of light shattered beneath Lionel's palm strike, the arm of his divine armor rippling like water. Despite the power of the strike, Lionel didn't take even a single step back as he perfectly dispersed its strength. But even so, his expression was serious. That casual attack was on the same level as that profound scythe strike from earlier, and yet she had done it without much effort. Lionel suddenly understood at that moment that if Harmony had the other half of the Northern Star lineage factor, her power would be absolutely unprecedented. A shadow and radiant sovereign in the same body. She was a monster. There were no shadows without the light. Light couldn't be bright without the darkness of night. When the two came together, they amplified and fed off one another. Even if Harmony used no other abilities, her strength had increased by over 10 times with absolute ease. Harmony's chest expanded and she suddenly unleashed a mighty cry. It sounded like a phoenix calling down the might of the skies, her small body causing a sound that resonated across the solar system as though she wanted every existence to bow down to her reign. Under the blinding light, her injuries healed almost instantly. The sound of her cry made Lionel's body rattle within his divine armor. If not for the very well have just experienced his heart rupture. Clang! A white chain suddenly manifested from the black hole surrounding Harmony. It was so fast that Lionel could react in time. He barely managed to put a hand up and block with his forearm, flooding his armor with void star force and wanting to repel it. However, the chain coiled around his arm as though his void star force wasn't there, restraining and forcing it down. Lionel felt a strong force pull him toward Harmony. Without hesitation, he roared. The vital star force pumping through him became like a crimson tide. The jade portions of his armor which had turned a radiant blue now became a bloody crimson. With a tug of his arm, the chain shattered beneath his might, but by that point, Harmony's scythe had already appeared before him. Lionel's other arm had swung down to meet her blade, his black rod forming a sharp edge that snaked forward. Just as the two blades met, Lionel sidestepped, causing Harmony's strike to become a glancing blow. At the same time, his free hand rotated through the air, the void star force it had been accumulating becoming even heavier as he struck outward. Harmony removed a hand from her scythe, countering with her own palm. Boom! Their palms couldn't even meet, separated by a wild fluctuation of force. Both sides seemed to carry an oppressive void-like energy, swallowing everything in its path and wanting to devour the other whole. The two were forced into a quick retreat, but they instantly stamped down against the air, surging forward and clashing once again. Their blows deformed the atmosphere, collapsing mountains beneath and causing vacuums of air that wiped out entire regions. Harmony suddenly vanished in a beam of light, appearing to Lionel's side. Lionel's brainstem lit up with a silver-gold color, his emulation spatial force activating as his hundreds of clones, each of them swinging forth with a towering spear force. Harmony continued to swing as though she didn't see them at all, clashing with Lionel and hooking her scythe into his guard and pulling his spear down. At that moment, Lionel's clones all attacked at once, their spear force riddling Harmony with holes. However, each and every hole fluttered with a black fog as though Harmony wasn't a corporeal existence anymore. Lionel released one of his hands from his spear, escaping from Harmony's hook attack and pulling back. But in retreating, Harmony's golden irises flashed, attacking Lionel's now open chest. Another beam of white light appeared before him, smashing against his broad chest. Boom! Lionel was sent flying back, his body torpedoing into the ground. Harmony stood in the skies, her arms raised and her mouth open as yet another cry echoed. The skies quaked and the oceans overturned, the pillars of lava growing in size as though in response. At that moment, the skies flipped toward absolute darkness on one side and a bright day on the other. Harmony's strength multiplied many times over. Even as Lionel burst out from the ground without the slightest scratch on him, her strength continued to multiply. Natural light realm, the universal force fell in tsunami-like waves. It felt as though all the universal force this region had to offer was being siphoned for the personal use of Harmony. Lionel took a breath and exhaled, entering an unprecedented state of calm. To his back, the radiant stars continued to pulse, but now, the crimson aura of his divine armor slowly became overwhelmed by a deep violet color. The final stage of Lionel's star fusion technique. King's Might. Boom. All of the chaos of the world seemed to vanish. The oceans became still, the pillars of lava calmed, the thunderous skies fell into silence. Dense violet fog billowed from Lionel's body. He took a breath and the vents of his helmet emitted a pale violet steam. Occasionally missing content, please report errors in time. Chapter 1796. Published at 19th of April 2023 10:46 and 30 seconds AM. Chapter 1796. If audio player doesn't work, press stop then play button again. 1796 Voice, disperse. At that moment, the split skies vanished. The endless darkness of one side and the bright day of the other disappeared under a single word. Lionel took a step and appeared before Harmony. Their cold gazes met as his spear struck out. A river of violet seemed to follow the thrust of his spear, the clouds splitting and the earth ripping beneath his feet. A lovely symphony played within the layers of his force, appearing before Harmony in the blink of an eye. Harmony raised her scythe to block, but it didn't seem to matter. Her wrists went numb and her shoulders were nearly ripped from their socket, and yet she oddly wasn't sent flying backward. It was as though the laws of physics had entirely changed to be suited to the will of a single man. Lionel unleashed a flurry of attacks, each one Harmony was forced to take the full brunt of without the ability to take even a single step backward. Her inner organs rattled and her bones fractures, blood oozed from her lips and the suffocating presence before her only became more unyielding and towering. All of a sudden, Harmony froze and it all hit her at once. Her clothing exploded to pieces and her scythe cracked. It felt like until now, she had just been facing the build-up of momentum before it was all unleashed at the same time, ripping her nearly to shreds. Boom! Harmony crashed into the ground and Lionel appeared to her sides though he had been there from the very beginning. The wind seemed to be entirely still around him, the only sound coming from the breathing of his armor, billowing violet fog reminiscent of a descending nebula filling his surroundings. Lionel reached down and pinched Harmony's finger, pulling the ring out of it. He looked toward the ring before looking toward her indifferently. The last time Lionel had used Star Fusion, King's Might, it was in his battle against Miguel. But the him of now and the him of back then couldn't even be placed within the same sentence. He might as well have been an entirely different person. Not to mention the fact his vital star force was purer and more powerful, being supplemented directly by his stars having entered the heavenly body realm, and his comprehension of King's Might was on an entirely different level. Star Fusion already allowed him to break the limits of his body by filling it with a body-type life force specifically known for its vitality. Anyone with a high affinity for vital star force would be a naturally strong person. If one was born with such an innate node, they would definitely have something akin to inborn divine strength. Lionel didn't have such a thing, but what he did have was arguably even better than that. Setting aside his stars, his divine armor was on a completely different level. It had a symbiotic relationship with him, no different from an innate node, and its affinity with life force, water force, and related forces was entirely off the charts. Any vital star force it absorbed without having 100-fold the effect it would have on just his body alone. But what was even more devastating for Harmony was that this wasn't even his strongest divine armor. Of his three, this one was the weakest. If this one had 100-fold effect, the second had 1,000-fold effect, and the final one had a 10,000-fold effect. What was of most importance here, though, was what would happen with King's Might applied to this. Emperor's Edict allowed Lionel to bend reality to his will. When King's Might and Vital Star Force were fused, Lionel's innate ability to break the laws of reality were applied directly to his body. This would allow him to do something like delay the true strength of his strikes by just enough that they would fuse together and be unleashed at once, seemingly one-shotting a genius on Harmony's level. Star Fusion is too excellent of a technique. I need to study Camelot's magic system more to see if I can create a night technique that is suited to Void Star Force as well. If I can do that, the power of my divine armor will multiply several times beyond what it is now. It wasn't that Lionel hadn't thought of this before, it was just that it was very troublesome. When Lionel created Star Fusion, he was in a region where no other force but Vital Star Force existed. On top of that, he had months of time where he was constantly thinking of ways to improve his strength using this force. Lionel didn't have an equivalent region comparable to the Dimensional Cleanse trial world for Void Star Force, so he couldn't guarantee such a thing. He would simply have to set this aside for now and wait for an opportunity. Either way, he had proved that this path of his divine armor was the right path. It had never felt so powerful before, but now it was well and truly like a divine armor. Lionel wondered what he should do with Harmony. He could kill her and use her soul to extract the information he needed. She should have an incredibly high standing in the Three-Finger Cult given everything. There was also the option of leaving her alive, as she could potentially be more useful as a slave if he branded her like she did the others of the Etching Metal organization. If she was a soul, she would only last 24 hours. But if she was alive, he could make use of her indefinitely, though she would also be a ticking time bomb. Lionel was pretty confident in defeating her. As things went, he hadn't used anywhere near all of his strength, though it had been a tough battle. But even so, having a potential backstabber waiting for him to slip up in the shadows wasn't exactly heartwarming either. Just as Lionel was about to make a choice, the spatial ring in his hands vibrated and his eyes narrowed. He took out what looked like a communication device and poured his force into it. He smirked inwardly, wondering what would come out of the other side. But surprisingly enough, it was a familiar voice. Hello, Lionel. Occasionally missing content, please report errors in time. You're tuning into the Carefree Valley YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.